He threw her trunk off the wagon before it even stopped moving. It hit the dirt road with a crack that echoed across the empty Kansas prairie, and every single person standing on that Holbrook street turned to look, not at the man who threw it, but at the woman it belonged to. Martha Ellsworth stood there with $17 in her coat pocket, her dead father not yet cold in the ground, and her uncle's voice still ringing in her ears. "You're a burden. You've always been a burden. I'm done." He hadn't even had the decency to look her in the eye when he said it. She was 28 years old, alone in a town that didn't know her name, and the only thing standing between her and the open Kansas sky was a worn-out trunk and whatever she had left inside herself. If you've ever been told you were too much, too heavy, too slow, too broken to matter, then you already know exactly what Martha felt standing in that street. This is her story, and I promise you, it doesn't end the way anyone expected. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because every week we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about real courage, real heartbreak, and people who refuse to stay down when the whole world told them to. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. We're just getting started. The telegram had been in Martha Ellsworth's coat pocket for 6 days before she finally let herself believe it was real. Help needed. Iron Bluff Ranch, Holbrook, Kansas. Harvest work, room and board. Inquire Silas Mercer. 11 words. That was all it was. 11 words printed on a strip of yellowed paper that a telegraph clerk had handed her without even making eye contact, the way people in Holbrook had started doing everything, looking just slightly past her, as if she were a piece of furniture someone had left in the middle of the road. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Her father had died on a Tuesday in July. The fever came fast, the way it always did that summer, and by Thursday he was gone. No warning, no slow farewell. No time for Martha to say any of the things daughters are supposed to say. Just gone. Like someone had simply reached into the house and taken him, and left everything else exactly as it was. She had sat at his kitchen table for 2 days after the burial, unable to move, unable to think clearly, listening to the sound of the house being quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Her uncle, Gerald Ellsworth, had arrived on Saturday morning. She'd heard his boots on the porch and thought for one stupid half-second that she felt relieved. She should have known better. Gerald was her father's younger brother, and the two men had never been close in the way that actually mattered. They'd shared a last name and an occasional holiday meal, and approximately nothing else. Gerald had a wife, 3 children, and a ranch of his own 40 miles east, and he had made it quietly but consistently clear over the years that Martha, unmarried, overweight, stubbornly independent, shaped nothing like what a woman in 1887 was supposed to look like, was not the kind of family he liked to claim too loudly. He walked into the kitchen without knocking. He looked around the room, the way a man looks at a problem he has to solve before supper. "You can't stay here," he said. "Not I'm sorry for your loss, not how are you holding up, just you can't stay here." Martha had looked at him across the table. "This is my father's house." "It's my house now," Gerald said, and there wasn't any cruelty in his voice. That was almost the worst part. He wasn't being cruel. He was just being practical, the way men like Gerald were always practical about things that cost them something. He left no will. "I'm the only living male relative. The law is clear." She had known he was right. She had known it even before he said it. That was the particular horror of the moment. Not that it was a surprise, but that she had already understood it was coming and still wasn't ready. "I need time," she said. "You have until the end of the month," he told her. Then he poured himself a cup of her father's coffee, sat down at her father's table, and started going through a stack of papers like she wasn't in the room anymore. Martha had stood up very slowly, walked to her bedroom, and sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. She did not cry. She wanted to. But something had locked up inside her, some mechanism that was supposed to release and just didn't. She sat there for a long time, breathing carefully, the way you breathe when you're trying to keep something from falling apart. Later, she would not be able to tell you exactly what she decided in that moment. Only that she decided something. The trunk had belonged to her mother, who had come over from Bavaria as a girl and had brought it with her on the ship across the ocean into a country that didn't speak her language or share her name or particularly care that she existed. Her mother had survived that. Her mother had built something out of nothing, twice, in a language she'd had to learn from scratch. Martha had grown up speaking both English and German in that house, the way you grow up breathing, without thinking about it, without choosing it. Her mother had been dead for 9 years, but every time Martha looked at that trunk, she felt something she couldn't explain. Not comfort exactly, more like instruction. You come from people who did not quit. She had $17. She had the trunk. She had the telegram. That was the inventory. The walk to Iron Bluff Ranch was 4 miles, and Martha knew it before she started. She had asked at the dry goods store, keeping her voice steady, keeping her chin level, ignoring the way the woman behind the counter let her eyes drift downward, and then back up with that particular expression Martha had spent her entire adult life pretending not to notice. The expression that said, "You're a lot of woman to be wandering around asking questions." 4 miles, the woman had said. West on the main road, then north at the Split Oak. You'll see the gate. "Thank you," Martha had said. She had gone back to the boarding house, packed the trunk as carefully as she could, and arranged for the landlady's teenage boy to help her lift it onto the 2-wheeled cart she'd borrowed from behind the livery stable. The boy had struggled. Martha had helped him lift, and she'd seen his face change when he realized she could take more of the weight than he could. People were always surprised by that. She'd learned not to explain it. She was a large woman. Everyone could see that, and most people spent the first 10 minutes of knowing her deciding what that meant about her before they'd given her a chance to speak 2 sentences. She'd stopped wasting her breath on explanations. Let them see what they were going to see. Eventually, if they paid attention, they'd see something else. Most people didn't pay attention. That was fine. She had stopped needing them to. The cart was harder than she'd expected. The road west of Holbrook was rutted and dry, and the wheels kept catching, and the sun was the particular kind of Kansas August sun that felt personal, like it had decided specifically to come after you. Her dress was damp before she'd gone half a mile. Her shoulders ached. Her boots, which were good boots but not new, began to feel like they were tightening around her feet. She did not stop. She was about 2 miles in when a wagon came up behind her, 2 men on the seat, heading west, and slowed alongside her. "That's a heavy load," the older one said. He had a sunburned neck and the look of a man who'd spent 40 years deciding things quickly. "Where you headed?" "Iron Bluff Ranch," Martha said without slowing down. "Mercer's place." There was a pause. She felt it more than heard it. "Mercer's?" the younger one said. He looked like the older one's son, which he probably was. "What for?" "Work," Martha said. "He sent a telegram." Another pause, longer this time. The wagon kept pace with her without any of them acknowledging that it was doing so. "You know what kind of work?" the older man asked. His voice had shifted slightly, not unkind, just careful. "Harvest work," Martha said. "Room and board." The younger man made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. His father shot him a look that silenced it. "We can give you a ride as far as the Split Oak," the older man said. Martha looked at the cart, then at the wagon, calculating. "I appreciate that," she said. They helped her lift the trunk into the wagon bed, and she climbed up onto the seat beside the older man. The younger one sat on the other side and stared straight ahead with the elaborate indifference of someone working hard at it. Nobody said anything for almost a mile. Then the older man said, quietly, not looking at her, "Mercer's a decent man. Lost his wife 2 years back. Got a boy about 8 years old." "I see," Martha said. "He's not easy," the man said. "Not mean, just not easy." "I'm not looking for easy," Martha said. He glanced at her then. Just a quick look, sideways, assessing. She didn't turn to meet it. She watched the road ahead, the flat brown Kansas landscape rolling away in every direction, the sky enormous and cloudless above it. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't suppose you are." They dropped her at the Split Oak without ceremony. The younger man helped her get the trunk back onto the cart without being asked, which Martha noted and filed away as a point in his favor. Then the wagon went north and she turned west, and she was alone again with the cart and the sun in the remaining 2 miles. The gate at Iron Bluff Ranch was iron, which she supposed explained the name, or part of it, anyway. The bluff was visible behind the main buildings, a low shelf of reddish rock that rose maybe 30 feet above the flat ground. It wasn't dramatic by any measure, but it was something, in a landscape where there wasn't much of anything. She stopped at the gate and looked through it. The ranch was not in good shape. She could see that immediately. The main house was solid, well built. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing. But the yard around it had the particular dishevelment of a place where someone was working hard but not working organized. Tools left where they'd been dropped. A fence line on the east side that was sagging badly. The kitchen garden between the house and the well had been mostly harvested but not tended, and what was left in the ground looked like it had been there longer than it should have been. She had seen places like this before. She knew what they meant. A man was coming across the yard toward her. Medium height, lean in the particular way of men who never ate enough during harvest, wearing a hat that had seen better years. He walked with purpose, but not hurry. The walk of someone who had learned a long time ago not to run unless there was fire. He stopped on the other side of the gate and looked at her. She looked at him. It was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 35, though the weather had done some additional work on him. His face was clean-shaven and angular, and his eyes were the kind of pale gray that looked washed out in the harsh afternoon light. There were lines at the corners of them that came from squinting, not from laughing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the trunk on the cart, then back at her. "You're here about the telegram," he said. His voice was flat and not unfriendly, and entirely without enthusiasm. "Martha Ellsworth," she said. "Yes." He didn't offer his hand. "Silas Mercer." "I know," she said. He looked at the trunk again, then at her again. She could see him doing the arithmetic, the same arithmetic everyone did, and she could see the moment he reached his conclusion. It moved across his face the way a cloud moves across open sky. There 1 second, then he'd smoothed it away, but not before she'd seen it. She had spent 28 years watching people do that arithmetic. She knew exactly what calculation he'd just run. Too heavy, too slow, too much work for what she'll be able to do. "What experience have you got?" he asked. "Farm work since I was 7, she said. "My father had a spread outside Holbrook before he got sick. Before that, my mother's family had land in Bavaria. I've cooked, canned, preserved, repaired, tended animals, and done field work. I'm not fast, but I don't quit, and I don't complain, and I don't make mistakes twice." I was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the yard between them, picking up a little dust. "The room isn't much," he said. "That's fine. The work is hard." "I know what harvest work is," she said. He looked at her one more time. She met his eyes and held them, not aggressively, not performing confidence she didn't feel, just steadily, the way her mother had taught her. You look a person in the eye and you let them see that you're still there. That's all. That's enough. Silas Mercer reached over and unlatched the gate. 50 cents a week plus room and board, he said. We eat twice a day during harvest. You keep the kitchen. You help with whatever else needs doing. All right, Martha said. She picked up the handles of the cart and started through the gate, and he stepped aside to let her pass. And that was how Martha Ellsworth came to Iron Bluff Ranch. Neither of them said anything else for a while. She pulled the cart across the yard toward the house, and he walked alongside her without offering to help with it, and she didn't ask him to. She noticed, as they crossed the yard, that the fence on the east side was worse up close than it had looked from the gate. 3 posts were leaning badly, and 2 of the cross rails had split and been tied back with wire in a way that would hold for maybe another week before it failed entirely. She noticed the way the kitchen garden lay, which beds had been turned, which hadn't, where the soil was still worth working before the first frost. She noticed the cellar door, which was set into a low mound behind the house. The latch was a simple one, and from here she could see that it wasn't properly flush. There was a gap that would let cold air in come winter, and worse, would let rainwater in if they got the wrong kind of storm. She filed all of it away without saying a word. The back door of the house opened, and a boy appeared in the doorway. He was about 8, like the man on the wagon had said, with his father's pale eyes and a rim of dirt around the collar of his shirt that suggested he'd been playing in something he probably shouldn't have been playing in. He looked at Martha with the frank, undisguised assessment that only small children and very old people still allowed themselves. "Are you the lady from the telegram?" he asked. "I am," Martha said. "My name is Martha." "I'm Thomas," the boy said. "Papa said a lady was coming to help. I didn't think you'd pull your own trunk." "Thomas," Silas said. "It's all right," Martha said. She looked at Thomas and felt something in her chest that she didn't examine too closely, because it was the specific ache of something you want that you've mostly managed to stop wanting. "I've been pulling my own things for a while now." Thomas seemed to find this satisfactory. He stepped back to let her through the door. The kitchen was not dirty exactly, but it had the particular untidiness of a room that nobody had been minding. Things were in the wrong places. The stores were arranged without logic. There was a smell of something that had been cooked too long and not cleaned up properly, and the window above the sink was so crusted with dust that the light coming through it was the color of old water. Martha set her bag down on the kitchen floor and looked around the room. Behind her, she heard Silas Mercer say, in a voice that was quieter than he probably intended, "It's not much." She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, holding his hat by the brim, turning it slightly in his hands, the only thing about him that wasn't still. "No," she said. "But it'll do." She meant it. She wasn't saying it to make him feel better. She genuinely meant it, because she had grown up understanding something that a lot of people never learned. It'll do is not a defeat. It'll do is a beginning. She set her jacket on the back of a chair, rolled up her sleeves, and started. The first thing she did was locate the water situation, because in a farmhouse kitchen, the water situation tells you everything. The pump was inside, which was a relief. She'd half expected to find it outside. It worked, though it needed priming, and she made a note of that. The second thing she did was look in the cellar. Silas had taken her trunk to her room by then. She'd heard him struggling with it on the stairs and deliberately not offered to help, because she'd understood without being told that he was a man for whom certain things needed to go a certain way, and him carrying a woman's trunk up to her room was one of those things. So she let him. The cellar was worse than she'd expected. Not ruined. There was still decent stock down there, some root vegetables, some preserved jars, a side of salt pork that looked all right, but it was disorganized in a way that meant things were going to get lost. And there was moisture damage on the east wall that hadn't been dealt with, and two of the shelf boards were sagging under the weight of what was on them. She stood there in this cool dark for a long moment, looking at all of it, doing her own arithmetic. They were 4 weeks from the first hard frost, maybe 5 if the season held. The harvest wasn't finished. The stores weren't enough even if it had been. There was work here that hadn't been done, and more work behind it, and behind that still more. A smaller person might have felt overwhelmed by that. Martha felt something different, something she'd learned the name of only recently: purpose. That specific feeling of looking at a problem and knowing in your bones that you are the person for it. She went back upstairs and started on supper. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway about 20 minutes later, drawn by the smell, which was the smell of food being cooked with actual intention behind it. "What's that?" he asked. "Corn chowder," Martha said. "Go wash your hands." He disappeared and reappeared 2 minutes later with damp hands and a look of cautious hope. "Papa doesn't make corn chowder," he said. "What does your papa make?" Martha asked, keeping her eyes on the pot. Thomas thought about this. "Mostly eggs," he said, "and sometimes bread. But the bread is usually pretty flat." "Flat bread is still bread," Martha said. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said. He climbed onto the bench on the near side of the table and sat down with his hands folded, watching her. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. "The last woman only stayed 2 weeks." Martha looked at him over her shoulder. His expression was carefully neutral, the particular neutrality of a child who has learned not to want things too openly because wanting them openly means getting hurt when they don't happen. She knew that face. She had worn it herself once. "I plan to," she said. "That's what she said too," Thomas said, but he said it matter-of-factly, without accusation, and then he looked down at the table. Silas appeared in the back doorway, hat off, hands recently washed. He stopped when he smelled the food, and something moved through his expression so quickly Martha nearly missed it. Not surprise exactly, more like a door that had been shut for a long time, opening just a crack, and then closing again before it could feel like anything. He sat down at the head of the table and Martha served the chowder, and for a while there was no sound except spoons against bowls and the wind beginning to pick up outside. Then Silas said, without looking up, "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," Martha said. She didn't believe in wasting food or wasting flavor. "German?" he said. "Half," Martha said. "My father was from Ohio. My mother came over when she was 12. Silas looked up at her then, just for a moment. "Came over alone?" "With her parents," Martha said. "They didn't make it. Ship fever. 2 days out of Hamburg. She made it to New York by herself, found a cousin in Philadelphia she'd never met, and started from there." There was a silence. "How old was she?" Thomas asked. 12, Martha said again. Thomas absorbed this with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old confronted with information that rearranges something. "That's younger than me," he said. "Yes," Martha said. "It is." Silas was looking at his bowl. His spoon had stopped moving. "She sounds like she was something," he said. "She was," Martha said. They ate the rest of the meal in quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than the silence Martha had been living inside for the past 6 weeks. It was not the quiet of being alone. It was the quiet of people who were still getting used to each other, but hadn't yet decided that was a bad thing. Martha washed the bowls after supper. Thomas dried them, because she handed him a cloth without asking, and he took it without argument, which told her something about him that she liked. Silas sat on the porch steps in the last of the evening light, and through the kitchen window she could see him looking west across the fields, the way men look when they're counting things that aren't going the way they need to go. She was putting away the last bowl when he came back inside. "You said you noticed things," he said. He didn't quite make it a question. "I try to," Martha said. "What did you notice today?" he asked. He wasn't testing her. She could hear that. He was genuinely asking, the way a man asks when he's exhausted and he knows he's missing things, and he needs someone to tell him what they are. Martha dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. "The east fence," she said. "You've got maybe a week before that wire tie fails and you lose the whole section. The cellar door isn't sealing and you'll get water damage before the first snow if it's not fixed. Your shelf boards on the south wall are bowing. You need to redistribute the weight or you'll have broken jars. And your kitchen garden has got 3 beds of carrots still in the ground that need to come up before the frost gets them, or you'll lose them." Silas had gone very still. He stopped, started again. "I knew about the fence." "I know," Martha said. I could see you knew. I'm just telling you what else." He looked at her for a long moment, the pale gray eyes, the lines at the corners, the hat in his hands again, turning. "All right," he finally said. He went to bed. She heard his boots on the stairs, and then silence. Martha Ellsworth stood alone in Silas Mercer's kitchen at 9 o'clock on an August evening, listening to the wind picking up across the Kansas plain, and felt for the first time in 6 weeks like she was somewhere that needed her to be exactly who she was. Not thinner, not quieter, not more convenient, just herself. With everything that had made her. The German grandmother who crossed an ocean alone at 12, the Ohio father who worked himself to death and loved her completely, the body that nobody thought was enough, and that had carried her 4 miles across a Kansas prairie without stopping. She banked the stove fire for the night. She checked the cellar latch on her way to her room. It was worse up close. She made a note to fix it in the morning. The room Silas had given her was small and smelled of cedar and disuse, and the window faced east, which meant she would wake with the sunrise whether she wanted to or not. The bed was narrow, and the mattress had seen better years. There was a hook on the back of the door, and a small table with a wash basin, and nothing else. Martha sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and looked at the room. $17, a worn-out trunk, a room with no mirror. She had the sudden irrational desire to write to her sister, who lived in Pennsylvania and had a husband and 3 children and a house with curtains in the windows. She hadn't written in months. She hadn't known what to say. She still didn't entirely, but she thought that tomorrow, or the day after, she might try. "I'm at a place called Iron Bluff Ranch in Holbrook, Kansas," she would write. "There is a man here who carries his grief the way you carry a stone in your boot. He knows it's there, he's used to it, he just keeps walking. There is a boy here who dried the dishes tonight without being asked twice. The kitchen needs work. The cellar needs work. The east fence needs work. I think I need to be here." She lay down on the narrow bed, still dressed, on top of the covers, and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the flat land with the particular sound it made at night. Not quite silence, not quite anything else. She had grown up with that sound. She had always found it, despite everything, oddly comforting. Like the land reminding you it was still there. Like the land saying, "I'm not going anywhere, neither should you." She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would fix the cellar latch, then the shelf boards. Then she would see about the fence. There was enough to do. There would be enough to do for a long time. That was fine. That was more than fine. Martha Ellsworth turned onto her side, pulled the thin quilt over her shoulders, and slept, for the first time in weeks, without dreaming about things she'd already lost. She fixed the cellar latch before sunrise. She hadn't planned to get up that early, Or rather, she hadn't planned anything because she'd gone to sleep expecting to be exhausted enough to sleep through the dawn for once in her life. But the east-facing window had done exactly what she'd known it would do, and by the time the first gray light came pushing through the glass, she was already awake, lying on her back, listening to the ranch breathe. A farm has a sound in the early morning that's different from any other time of day. She'd grown up knowing it. It wasn't peaceful exactly. It was more like waiting. The animals stirring, the wood of the house settling, the wind coming down off the open plain and running its fingers along the eaves. Everything on the edge of starting. She got up, dressed in the dark by feel, and went downstairs without lighting a lamp. The cellar latch took her 20 minutes and a piece of iron wire she found coiled on a shelf above the back door, where someone had left it without apparent purpose. She worked by the early light coming around the side of the house, her fingers cold, the wire stiff, bending it into a proper catch that would hold the door flush against its frame. It wasn't pretty work, but it would hold, and it would hold through winter, and that was what mattered. She was back in the kitchen and had the stove lit by the time she heard Silas's boots on the stairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he had the night before, that brief, barely visible pause, like a man who has gotten used to walking into an empty room and keeps being surprised that it isn't empty anymore. He looked at the stove, which was lit. He looked at the coffee, which was made. He looked at Martha, who was slicing bread at the counter with her back to him. "You fixed the cellar latch," he said. "Needed doing," Martha said. "I was going to get to it." "I know," she said. She turned around with a plate of bread and set it on the table. "I was already up." He sat down and poured his coffee and looked at the bread and didn't say anything else for a moment. There was something working in his face that he was doing a decent job of keeping in check. Not gratitude exactly, or not just that. More like a man recalibrating something he'd thought he had figured out. "Thomas will be up soon," he said finally. "He doesn't eat much in the morning." "He'll eat," Martha said, and went back to the stove. Thomas appeared 12 minutes later with his hair going in 3 directions and his boots on the wrong feet, which he either hadn't noticed or had decided not to care about. He stopped when he smelled the eggs, and his face did something uncomplicated and honest that Martha found she had to look away from for a second. "You cooked again," he said. "That's generally what happens at mealtimes," Martha said. Thomas climbed onto the bench, fixed his boots without being told, and ate everything on his plate. Silas watched this with an expression that was carefully neutral in a way that probably meant something, but Martha didn't push at it. There were things in this house she was going to have to learn slowly, and she knew it. After breakfast, Silas told her what the day's work was. He talked the way he did most things, without wasted words, laying it out in plain sequence. The Northfield still had 2 days of harvest left. He needed to bring in what was left of the corn before the weather turned. He had one hired hand, a taciturn young man named Dell, who would arrive by 7, and between the 3 of them they needed to get the grain moved before the afternoon, because the sky to the northwest had that particular color that meant weather. Martha looked at the northwest sky through the kitchen window. She saw what he meant. "What about the root cellar?" she asked. "The south shelf boards are going to fail before tonight if you put anything else on them." Silas paused. "I'll get to the boards." "I can do it this morning while you're in the north field," she said. "I'll need lumber. Is there any cut?" He looked at her for a moment with that assessing expression that she was starting to recognize as his version of taking someone seriously. "Behind the barn," he said. "There's cut pine. Take what you need." Dell arrived at 7, as promised. He was maybe 20, broad-shouldered, with a face that hadn't quite finished deciding what it was going to look like, and he regarded Martha with the particular brand of politely disguised skepticism that young men of that era used when they encountered a woman doing something they decided was not what women did. He didn't say anything rude. He just managed to make his silence communicate everything his words were leaving out. Martha had encountered this species of young man before. She found that they generally came around eventually, or they didn't, and either way she'd already decided not to need his approval. She spent the morning in the cellar. It was the kind of work nobody noticed when it was done right. Redistributing weight across failing boards, pulling the south shelving apart, and rebuilding it with the cut pine, making sure the heaviest stores were low and the lighter ones were up. She found 3 jars in the back corner with faulty seals that would have gone bad before Christmas, and she pulled those out and set them aside to deal with. She found a box of onions that were starting to turn and sorted out the ones worth keeping. She found a leather harness that had been left to dry without being oiled and was going stiff along the joints. She oiled the harness. She didn't mention it to anyone. By noon, when she heard the wagon coming back from the north field, the cellar was reorganized, the shelving was solid, the bad jars were out, and the floor was swept. She had also identified two other things that were going to be problems. A barrel of water in the corner that had developed a slow leak and needed to be recouped, and a section of the north wall where moisture was coming through from outside, which meant there was probably a gap somewhere in the siding above. She made a list. Not a list for anyone else, just for herself, written in the back of a small notebook she'd carried for years. Her handwriting compact and straight, half English and half the German shorthand. Her mother had taught her that was faster to write and harder for anyone else to read. Thomas found her at the cellar door when she came up. "Papa says come eat," he said. He looked past her at the cellar steps with naked curiosity. "What were you doing down there all morning?" "Fixing things," Martha said. "What things?" "Shelves. A few other things." He thought about this. "Dell said you probably couldn't carry the lumber yourself," he said. He delivered this information with the matter-of-fact candor that was either going to make him a very honest adult or a very unpopular one, possibly both. "Dell was wrong," Martha said. Thomas nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I thought so," he said, and ran ahead of her toward the house. Bye. Lunch was bread and cold pork, and the last of the morning's coffee, eaten standing at the kitchen counter because Harvest didn't wait for anyone to sit down. Dell ate quickly without looking at Martha and went back out. Silas ate slowly, studying something in his own head, and Martha could see the numbers running behind his eyes. The same calculation every farmer ran in August. The one where you counted what you had against what you needed and hoped the gap was small enough to bridge. "How much more in the north field?" she asked. "Day and a half," he said. "Maybe less if the weather holds." "It won't," Martha said. She said it flat, without drama, because it wasn't drama. It was just what the sky had been saying all morning to anyone who bothered to look at it. "You've got until this evening, maybe. That line to the northwest has been moving since 7. Silas looked at the window. His jaw tightened slightly. "You read weather?" "My father did," Martha said. "I grew up watching him. That color, that height on the horizon, the way the wind keeps shifting south. You're going to get something hard by dark." There was a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of a man deciding how much weight to put on something he hadn't expected. "How hard?" he asked. "Hard enough that you want your stock in and your loose equipment tied down before it gets here," she said. "And I'd want the cellar door secured. I reinforced the latch this morning, but if you get real wind, you'll want something heavier on it." Silas pushed back from the counter and put on his hat. He called out the back door for Dell, and Martha heard them talking in the yard in low, rapid voices, the tone shifting from routine to something more urgent. She went back to the kitchen and started on the kitchen garden. The carrots came up harder than she'd expected. The soil had dried out more than it should have, which was another thing nobody had been minding. And by the time she'd pulled the last of the 3 beds, her back was telling her about it in terms that were not polite. She ignored it. She had learned a long time ago that her body was capable of more than it was comfortable with, and the gap between those two things was where most of the useful work happened. Thomas appeared beside her sometime in the second hour, without being asked, and started pulling carrots. I was not fast. He was also not careful about which ones he grabbed. He pulled a few that weren't ready, and Martha corrected him twice, quietly, without making it a thing. By the third time, he got it right on his own. She noted that he learned by watching, not by instruction. He'd look at what she was doing and then duplicate it, rather than trying to follow verbal directions. Useful to know. "My mother used to do the garden," he said, after they'd been working in silence for a while. Martha kept pulling. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" he asked. "Because nobody's been doing it since, and the way it's laid out tells me someone knew what they were doing when they planned it," she said. "She knew what she was growing and why." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She died," he said. "I know," Martha said again. "I'm sorry." "Papa doesn't talk about her," he said. "Not really. Sometimes he says her name, Anna, when he thinks I'm asleep. But not when I'm awake." Martha didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been the wrong thing. She just kept pulling carrots, and Thomas kept pulling carrots beside her, and after a while he didn't seem to need a response. That was something her mother had taught her too. Sometimes you didn't answer. Sometimes you just stayed. They got all 3 beds up before the wind started shifting in earnest. The storm came in faster than even Martha had expected. She'd thought they had until dark. The sky had other ideas. By 4 in the afternoon, the light had gone strange, that greenish, flattened quality that meant the clouds were doing something serious high up that you couldn't see yet. The wind had stopped shifting and committed hard to the south, which was the wrong direction, the direction that meant what was coming had height and weight behind it. Martha was in the kitchen when she felt it, not heard it, felt it, through the soles of her feet and in the way the house seemed to hold its breath for half a second. She went to the back door. The sky to the northwest was not the color sky was supposed to be. She did not wait. She went to the cellar door first and pulled it open and looked at the shelving she'd fixed that morning. Solid, everything where it should be, and then started moving. The carrots they'd pulled were still in the garden basket. She got those down the cellar steps in 2 trips. The preserve jars she'd reorganized that morning were already properly stowed, but she moved the 3 oldest ones with the best seals to the bottom shelf, the most protected position, because those were the ones they'd need first if the winter was bad, and she wasn't losing them to a storm. She came back up and found Thomas in the yard, standing very still, looking at the sky. Thomas, she said, in a voice that was not loud, but was the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed immediately. Inside. He looked at her. He was scared. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. But he was also doing that thing children did when they were scared and didn't want to admit it, which was to stand very still and pretend to be studying something. Thomas. She said it again, the same way. He came inside. Martha went to the barn. She had not been in the barn since she arrived, and she took about 4 seconds to assess it. 2 horses in stalls, a mule, chickens in the back corner, a stack of loose hay bales on the south side that were going to be a problem if the roof took any damage. The barn doors faced west, which was where the wind was going to hit first. She got the doors latched, both of them, the big ones, with the drop bar she found hung on the wall, and checked the stalls and made sure the animals had water. And then she went back outside and nearly ran into Silas coming from the field at a pace that was almost a run. He had seen the sky. "Where's Thomas?" he said immediately. "Inside," Martha said. "I got the barn doors latched and the animals are in. I moved the cellar stores to the south shelves. The carrots are down." He stopped. Just for a second. He actually stopped moving and looked at her, and something passed across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "The loose timber behind the barn," she said, "and the water barrel by the east fence. If you can get the timber tied down—" "Dell," he said, already moving past her, calling over his shoulder. "Dell, get the timber." She went back inside. Thomas was at the kitchen window watching the sky. Martha went to the window beside him and watched it too for a moment, and then she made a decision. "Come on," she said. She took him to the cellar, not to hide, or not exactly. But the cellar was stone-walled and below ground, and if the storm was as serious as the sky was suggesting, stone and earth were better than wood. She brought the extra quilt from the hook in the hallway, and the lamp, and the bag of candles from the kitchen shelf, and Thomas's boots which he had kicked off by the back door, and she got all of that down the cellar steps and settled Thomas on the lowest shelf with the quilt around him and the lamp lit. He looked at her with those pale eyes that were so much his father's. "Is it going to be bad?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Martha said, which was the truth, and she'd decided a long time ago that children deserved the truth more than they deserved comfortable lies, because comfortable lies were what made them grow up unprepared. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought about this honestly. "A little," she said, "but scared is fine. Scared just means you're paying attention." Thomas absorbed this. "My mother said something like that," he said. Martha looked at him. I was looking at the lamp. "What did she say?" Martha asked. "She said brave isn't not being scared," Thomas said. "It's doing the thing anyway." Martha was quiet for a moment. "She was right," she said. Then the storm hit. It hit the way serious. Kansas storms hit, not with a buildup, not with a warning rattle that gave you time to prepare, but with a full-body impact that felt less like weather and more like something solid striking the house from every direction at once. The cellar door shuddered in its frame. The lamp flickered. Thomas pulled the quilt tighter and did not make a sound, which Martha respected more than she could have said. She kept her hand on the lamp base to steady it and counted, the way her father had taught her. Count the seconds between the lightning and the thunder, divide by 5. That's your miles. The lightning was close. Close enough that the thunder was nearly simultaneous, a sharp crack rather than a rumble, the kind that meant the bolt had hit something nearby. She didn't know what it had hit. She would find out later. The worst of it lasted 40 minutes by her count, though it felt both longer and shorter than that in the way time did strange things inside a storm. Thomas fell asleep somewhere in the middle of it, which she hadn't expected. He just put his head down on the quilt and went quiet, and then she realized he was out. She thought that said something about him that she liked, that his body had decided on some level that he was safe enough to sleep. She sat on the bottom step with her back against the stone wall and listened to the storm work itself through above them, and she thought about her mother at 12 years old on a ship in the middle of an ocean, with both her parents dead and no language and no money and no plan except to get to New York and find a cousin whose address was written on a piece of paper her father had given her the morning he got sick. Martha had always thought of that image when she needed to remind herself what she was made of. The storm broke sometime around 6 in the evening. Not gradually. It broke the way it had come, more or less all at once. The hammering weight of it, lifting and leaving behind a quiet that rang in your ears because the sound of the storm had been filling them so completely. Martha went up the cellar steps and opened the door carefully, checking above her as she came out. The yard was a mess. Branches down, a section of the chicken coop fence torn loose and lying 20 feet from where it should have been, the wagon tarpaulin gone entirely. There was a smell of ozone and wet earth and something that might have been char. Silas was in the yard. He'd found the tarpaulin. It was draped over the east fence like it had been thrown there by a careless giant. His hat was gone. His shirt was soaked through. He was standing very still, looking at something on the far side of the barn. Martha looked. A cottonwood at the edge of the property had been split by lightning. She'd heard that crack. She'd counted it. She'd known something took a hit. Half of it had fallen away from the barn by maybe 10 feet. 10 feet in the other direction, and it would have taken the barn roof. Silas turned and saw her. "Thomas?" he said. His voice was flat, controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. "Asleep in the cellar," Martha said. "He's fine." Something moved through Silas Mercer's face and then was gone. He looked back at the split cottonwood. "Timber's tied down," he said after a moment. "Dell got it before the worst of it. The animals are all right. I think we lost a section of the chicken fence, but I saw it," Martha said. "I can fix that tomorrow." He looked at her. She looked at him. The evening air between them still had that strange washed quality that came after a hard storm, everything smelling clean in a way that never quite lasted. "You moved the cellar store," he said. Not a question. He'd been down to check. "This morning," Martha said, "when I redid the shelves. And the carrots. This afternoon. And the barn. Before the storm hit." I was quiet for a long moment. The wet grass between them caught the last of the fading light. "I had a woman here last spring," he said. He was looking at the cottonwood again, not at her. "She lasted 2 weeks. Before her, there was another one who didn't make it past the first month." He stopped. "They were both capable women. I'm not saying they weren't." Martha waited. I want you to know that I don't—" He stopped again. She could see him working at something he didn't have the right words for, the way people did when they were trying to say something they hadn't said out loud before. "I'm not good at this," he said. I'm not good at having people here. I know the places—" He made a gesture with one hand that took in the yard, the storm damage, the general condition of everything. "I know it's a lot." "It's a ranch," Martha said. "Ranches are a lot." "You knew about the storm," he said. "You'd already started fixing things before I—" He shook his head. "How?" Martha thought about how to answer that honestly. "I grew up watching," she said. "My mother watched everything. She said the world was always telling you what it was about to do, if you paid attention." Silas was quiet for a while. A night bird had started up somewhere beyond the bluff, the sound thin and clear in the washed air. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," he said. "She was ordinary," Martha said. "She was ordinary in a situation that forced her to be remarkable. I think most people are like that. They just don't always get the situation." He looked at her then, held it for a moment. Not the calculating look he'd given her at the gate, not the assessing look she'd been getting all day. Something different, something that didn't have a category yet. "I'm going to get Thomas," he said. "I'll start supper." Martha said. On. Dell left before supper without saying much, which was consistent with everything else about him. He had done solid work through the storm, and Martha marked that in his favor, even if he was still conducting his silence campaign in her general direction. She made the corn chowder again because she had the ingredients and it was what the evening called for. Something hot and substantial, something that made the house smell like there were people in it. Thomas woke up from his cellar nap and came to the table with the specific disorientation of a child who has slept at the wrong time and is not entirely sure what day it is. "Did the storm stop?" he asked. "Hours ago," Martha said. He looked around the kitchen, then out the window at the dark. "Did everything make it?" "Mostly," Martha said. "One tree took a hit. Fence needs some work. The rest held." Thomas thought about this. "Because you moved everything," he said, not a question. "Because your father tied down the timber," Martha said. "And because Dell got the barn doors." Thomas considered. "And because you moved everything," he repeated, as if she'd missed his point. Martha looked at him. He was looking at her with that direct, unwavering gaze that children had before they learned to soften things for the sake of social comfort. "And because I moved everything," she conceded. Thomas nodded, satisfied. "That's what I thought," he said. Silas came in from checking the outbuildings and sat down at the table without washing his hands first, which Martha noted and decided not to say anything about. There were times when a person was at the end of themselves, and you didn't add to it, and ate. He ate more than he had at lunch, which meant something. Hunger was often the last thing men like him noticed when they were under pressure, so eating meant the pressure had eased slightly. She had learned to read these small things a long time ago, because small things were often what you had. After supper, Thomas went upstairs without being told, which suggested he was still half asleep. Silas poured a second cup of coffee and sat back at the table and looked at the middle distance. Martha washed the bowls. She didn't interrupt what he was thinking. After about 10 minutes, he said, "The neighbors are going to have had it worse." Martha kept washing. "How far is the nearest place?" "Halbert's, about 2 miles east," he said. "Old Tom Halbert. He's got a woman who helps him and 2 farmhands. They'll have been all right." He paused. "The Fenwick place is 3 miles north. They've been having a hard year." "Should you check on them in the morning?" Martha asked. "Probably," he said. She finished the washing and dried her hands and sat down across from him, because this seemed like a conversation that needed both of them at the table. "How bad is their year?" she asked. Silas looked at his coffee. "Lost their horse in June. Their corn came in short. Cole Fenwick's got 3 children and another one coming." He said it without judgment, just information, the way farmers talked about each other's situations, which was always a form of accounting. Who had what? Who needed what? Who was likely to make it through winter? "They're not the only ones," Martha said. He looked at her. "The dry goods store," Martha said. "When I was in town, 3 different people came in while I was there asking about credit. And the way the clerk talked, it wasn't new. It's been going on a while." Silas was quiet. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "It's been a hard 2 years," he said. Some of the places are on their last season." Martha thought about that for a moment. She thought about the cellar downstairs, reorganized, restocked, not full, but better than it had been. She thought about the carrots she'd pulled, the jars she'd sorted, the 12 more things on her list that still needed doing. "Your stores are better than you think," she said. "Not good. I'm not saying good, but better. If we're careful through the rest of harvest, and we get the kitchen garden fully in before the frost, you'll make it through winter with margin." "Margin," he repeated like it was a word from a foreign language. "Enough to share some of it," Martha said, "if it came to that." He looked at her across the table. That look again. The one without a category. She kept her eyes on his and didn't look away, not because she was trying to make a point, but because she meant what she'd said, and she wanted him to see that she meant it. "You've been here one day," he said. "I know," Martha said. "And you're already talking about—" "I'm talking about making a plan," Martha said. "I'm not saying do it now. I'm saying it's possible, and possible is worth knowing." Silas sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the table, then somewhere to the side that wasn't quite either of them. "My wife used to do that," he said, quietly, like the word surprised him by coming out. "Make plans. She could look at the cellar and tell me how the winter was going to go before October." Martha didn't say anything. "She was right most of the time," he said. "More than I was." He picked up his coffee, found it was empty, and set it down again. I haven't been, since she died. I haven't. He stopped. Things have been slipping, he said finally. I know they have. When you're in the middle of it, you can't always see. I know, Martha said. You fixed the cellar latch, he said. First thing this morning. It needed doing, Martha said. It's been like that for 3 months, he said. She didn't say anything to that either. She didn't need to. Silas Mercer sat at his own kitchen table on a stormy August evening and looked at the woman who had been in his house for less than 24 hours and had, in that time, fixed the cellar latch, rebuilt the south shelving, reorganized 2 seasons' worth of stores, pulled 3 beds of carrots, assessed the storm before it hit, secured the barn, gotten his son into safety, and moved every essential thing in the root cellar to where it needed to be before the worst arrived. And the thing that seemed to be sitting in the room between them, not quite said, was this. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know how to absorb a person who came in and just did the thing. Without complaint, without negotiation, without asking for recognition. Who saw the problem before it was a crisis and moved before anyone told her to. He had been expecting something much less than this. She had been expecting to have to prove herself for longer than a day. Neither of them acknowledged either of these things out loud. I should check the east fence in the morning, she said, before I do the chicken coop. Dell can do the fence, Silas said. Dell's going to have his hands full in the north field if you're going to finish before the next weather comes, Martha said. I'll do the fence. A pause. All right, he said. She stood up and pushed in her chair. Good night, Mr. Mercer. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Silas, she looked at him. You can call me Silas, he said. Not warmly. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was something. A door opened slightly. Good night, Silas, Martha said. She went upstairs. She lay on the narrow bed again, and this time she did not feel the exhaustion the way she had the night before. Or it was a different kind of exhaustion, less the weight of grief and more the clean, honest tiredness of having worked hard at something that needed doing. Her shoulders ached. Her back had not forgiven her for the carrots. Her hands were chapped from the cellar work and the storm. She lay there and listened to the house settle after the storm, and thought about Anna Mercer, whom she had never met and about whom she knew almost nothing except that she had planned a kitchen garden with thought and care and intention, and that her 8-year-old son still held her voice in his memory with perfect fidelity, quoting her without knowing he was quoting her. Brave isn't not being scared, it's doing the thing anyway. Martha looked at the ceiling and felt the particular quality of a place that was starting, just slightly, just at the very edges, to feel like somewhere she might belong. She did not let herself think that too loudly. She knew better than that. She had $17 and a week's employment and a ranch that was held together partly with wire and partly with stubbornness, and none of that was permanence. But the east window was already going lighter, and she had a fence to fix in the morning, and the chicken coop after that, and the water barrel that needed recouping, and the gap in the north siding she'd need to locate, and a kitchen garden that still had work left in it. She closed her eyes. There was enough to do. That was still enough. The fence took most of the morning. It wasn't just the storm damage. The storm had exposed what was already failing, the way storms generally did. 2 of the posts that had been leaning before the weather hit were now down entirely, pulled out of the earth by the wind's weight on the wire, and the ground around them was soft enough from the rain that she could see the rot at the base of both. They hadn't been holding for a long time. They'd just been standing there looking like they were holding, which was a different thing. Martha pulled them out by hand, which took longer than she would have liked, and left her with splinters across both palms. She dug the new post holes with the iron spade she found in the barn, each one going down 18 inches the way her father had taught her. Less than that. And you're just decorating the ground, Marta. You're not building anything. And she got the new posts in and tamped the earth back solid around them, and then restrung the wire, working from east to west, keeping the tension even. Dell watched her for about 10 minutes from the direction of the north field before he apparently decided he had somewhere else to be. She didn't acknowledge that he'd been watching. She just kept working. By the time she was done, the sun had come over its peak, and her back was making the same complaints it had made the afternoon before, louder this time. She stood at the finished fence line and looked at it. It wasn't pretty. The posts were slightly different heights because she'd had to work with what the lumber pile gave her. But it was solid, and it would hold through winter, and that was what it needed to do. She went to find the chicken coop. Thomas found her there an hour later, patching the section of fence the storm had torn free. He appeared at her elbow without announcing himself, which she was starting to understand was simply how he moved through the world. He didn't make entrances, he just arrived, as if he'd always been slightly present and had finally decided to make it official. "Dell says you don't know what you're doing," he said. Martha kept working. "What does Dell say I'm doing wrong?" Thomas considered this carefully. "He didn't say you were doing it wrong. He said you don't know what you're doing." "That's a different thing," Martha said. "I know," Thomas said. "I asked him what the difference was, and he said to ask your father." He paused. "I don't think he meant Papa." Martha almost smiled. She kept it controlled. "Hand me that wire clip," she said. He handed it over. He watched her work for a while. "I think he's wrong," Thomas said finally. "About what?" "About you not knowing what you're doing." "Thank you," Martha said. "You do know what you're doing," he said. "You just do it differently than he does." Martha stopped and looked at him. He was watching the fence with an expression of serious concentration, like he was solving something. "That's a fair thing to say," she said. He looked up at her. "My mother did things differently too," he said. "Papa used to say she did things her way." He said it like it was annoying, but he was smiling when he said it. Martha looked at her hands for a moment. Then she went back to the wire. "Your father smiles?" she said. Thomas was quiet for a second, then very seriously. "Sometimes. Not as much as before." He picked up a loose staple from the ground and turned it in his fingers. "He smiled at breakfast yesterday, when you weren't looking." Martha kept her eyes on the fence. "Did he?" she said. "Just a little," Thomas said. "But it counted." The North Field finished on the third day, which was a half day earlier than Silas had planned and later than Martha had hoped. But it was done, and the grain was in before the second weather system that had been sitting on the northwest horizon finally made its move. This one wasn't violent. It was the slow, grinding kind of autumn storm that settled in and stayed, bringing 3 days of cold rain that turned the yard to mud and made outside work largely impossible. Martha had been waiting for those 3 days. She spent them inside, which was where the other half of the problem lived. The house itself was structurally sound. Silas had built well, or whoever had built it had built well. But it had the particular accumulation of small failures that came from 2 years of a man running a property alone, managing everything that kept the operation going, while the things that just kept the house livable slowly fell behind. A window seal in the back bedroom that had cracked and let cold air in around the frame. 2 stair treads that had worked loose and squeaked dangerously. Dangerous because in the dark you'd step wrong and go down. A door latch in the kitchen that had been repaired with the wrong size screw and pulled loose every time someone closed the door with any energy behind it. She fixed the stairs first because Thomas ran up and down them approximately 40 times a day, and she didn't want to think about what happened if he caught a loose tread in the wrong direction. Then the window. She found a tin of glazing compound in the barn, mostly dried out but still workable if you added a little linseed oil, which she also found. She recaulked the frame and let it set overnight with a piece of wood she cut to wedge the window shut against the cold while it dried. The latch she fixed with the right size screw, which she located in a small tin box on the workbench in the barn that had apparently been there for years and had never quite been connected to the problem it was meant to solve. Thomas followed her from repair to repair on the first 2 days, not always helping, but always watching, the way children watch things that interested them, with a complete, unself-conscious attention that adults mostly lost. She gave him tasks when there were tasks he could do. When there weren't, she let him watch and answered his questions when he had them. He had a lot of questions. They were good ones, mostly. He wanted to know why. Why the linseed oil? Why 18 inches for a fence post? Why you repaired a window seal from the inside and not the outside? Martha answered everyone, not because she had unlimited patience. She didn't, not always. But because she remembered being the child who asked why and getting because I said so, and she had decided early that she would never be that person if she could help it. On the afternoon of the second rain day, she taught him to mend a tear in cloth. She hadn't planned to. It had come about practically. She'd found a stack of Silas's shirts in the corner of the bedroom that needed mending, and she'd brought them down to the kitchen table where the light was better. And Thomas had watched her for about 5 minutes and then asked if he could try. She'd handed him a needle, threaded it for him, and shown him the basic stitch. He was terrible at it. I was also completely undeterred by this, which she liked. He kept at it with a focus that was almost physically visible, his tongue coming to the corner of his mouth the way it did when he was concentrating. And by the end of the second shirt, he was still not good at it, but he was less bad than he had been. "Why are you teaching me this?" he asked. Not suspicious, genuinely curious. "Because it's useful," Martha said. "Dell says mending is women's work," Thomas said. He said it the way he said most things, straightforwardly, presenting the information, not endorsing it. "Dell also said I didn't know what I was doing with the fence," Martha said. "And the fence is holding." Thomas considered this. "So Dell is wrong about some things," he said. "Most people are wrong about some things," Martha said. "The useful skill is figuring out which things." Thomas pulled his needle through carefully, tongue at the corner of his mouth. "Are you wrong about some things?" he asked. "Frequently," Martha said. He looked up at her. "What are you wrong about?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm impatient sometimes, and I hide it. And hiding impatience is worse than showing it because then people don't know you're impatient and they can't adjust. And I sometimes decide I know how something needs to be done before I've asked enough questions about it." Thomas considered this evaluation with the seriousness he applied to most things. "Papa is impatient too," he said. "He doesn't hide it, though." "I know," Martha said. "Is that better or worse?" "Different," Martha said. "Hiding it is a bad habit I got from not wanting to seem difficult. Your father doesn't hide it because he doesn't care as much about seeming difficult." Thomas nodded slowly, processing. "I think I'm more like you," he said. Martha looked at him. He was bent back over his mending, tongue at the corner of his mouth, needle moving slowly and earnestly through the fabric. She felt that ache again, the one she'd been keeping carefully to one side, the one that had to do with things she'd stopped letting herself want. She breathed through it and went back to her own shirt. "You might be," she said quietly. "That's not a bad thing to be." Silas came in from the barn on the second rain evening to find Martha at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something in what appeared to be two languages simultaneously. He stopped in the doorway. He had that habit, she'd noticed, of stopping in doorways before he entered a room, like he was checking that it was still the same room he'd left, and looked at what she was doing. "German?" he said. "Notes," Martha said. "Half and half. The German is faster for some things." He came and sat down at the table, which he did more easily now than he had on the first night. Not comfortably exactly, but with less of the stiffness that came from a man who wasn't sure he had the right to be at ease in his own kitchen. "What kind of notes?" he asked. Martha turned the paper so he could see it. She had drawn a rough layout of the cellar and the kitchen garden, with small annotations in both languages indicating what was stored where and in what quantity, what needed restocking before November, what could wait, and what was frankly not going to be enough no matter what they did. Silas studied it. His face did the thing it did when he was processing information he hadn't known he needed. A slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that meant he was running the numbers. "We're short on salt pork," he said. "By about a third," Martha said. "I can get to Holbrook next week." "The price will have gone up," Martha said. "The dry goods store was already adjusting for the season when I came through. If you wait another week, it'll be worse." Silas was quiet. "There's another option," Martha said. She hesitated, because this was the part she hadn't known how to bring up, and she'd been working up to it. "The Fenwicks, you said their horse died in June." "That's right. Do they still have hogs?" Silas looked at her. "2, he said. "Maybe 3. If they're planning to winter over more animals than they can feed, they might want to sell one for butchering," Martha said. "It would help them with their feed costs, and it would close your salt pork gap without you paying store prices." Silas was quiet for a long time. She could see him working through it, not the logic of it, which she thought he'd grasped immediately, but something else. Something that had to do with pride, or with the particular kind of reluctance that came from asking for something, even when what you were offering was fair value in return. "I don't want them to think," he started. "You're not asking for help," Martha said carefully. "You're offering them a transaction that solves a problem they have. That's different." He looked at her. "You're very good at making things sound different than they are," he said. There was no sharpness in it. He almost sounded like he meant it as a compliment, though she could tell he wasn't entirely sure about that himself. "I'm very good at making things sound like what they actually are," Martha said, "which is sometimes different from how people have been thinking about them." Silas looked at the paper again, then at his hands. Then at the window where the rain was still coming down in the patient, persistent way it had been all day. "I'll go see Cole Fenwick tomorrow," he said, "if it clears enough." "It'll clear by morning," Martha said. He looked at her. "The pressure changed this afternoon," she said. "You can feel it in your ears if you pay attention. The rain will be done by midnight." He held her gaze for a moment. She'd gotten used to this. The way he looked at her when she said something he hadn't expected, checking it against something internal, deciding whether to file it under right or wrong. "If you're right," he said, "I'm going to stop being surprised when you say things like that." "That seems efficient," Martha said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close. He said good night and went upstairs, and Martha stayed at the table with her notes a little longer, and she added 3 more items to the list, and then she went to bed. The rain stopped at 11:30. She heard it, heard the silence where the rain had been, which was its own kind of sound. She lay in the dark and felt the particular satisfaction of being right about something small, and thought about how her mother had known the weather the same way, and how Martha had spent years thinking of it as a talent, and had only recently started understanding it was really just attention, sustained over time. Silas went to the Fenwick place the next morning and came back in the early afternoon with a deal struck. 1 hog, to be collected at the end of the week, in exchange for the use of Silas's horse through October, since the Fenwick's draft horse was gone and they needed to get their own remaining harvest in. He told Martha about it at lunch, simply, without making much of it. But she noticed he sat down at the table first and told her before he'd even hung up his coat, which was not the order of operations she'd observed in him before. "Cole Fenwick asked who gave me the idea," he said. "What did you tell him?" Martha said. "The truth," Silas said. He poured his coffee. "He wants to meet you." Martha looked up from the bread she was slicing. "He's heard of you," Silas said. There was something careful in the way he said it. "He's heard of me," Martha repeated. "I've been here 10 days. Dell talks," Silas said. "And the Halberts saw you fixing the east fence, and apparently Ruth Halbert mentioned it to someone in town, and that someone—" He made a gesture that communicated the rest without requiring words. Martha set down the bread knife. "What exactly has he heard?" Silas looked at his coffee. "That I'd hired a woman from Holbrook," he said. "That she'd come on foot and pulled her own trunk 4 miles. That she'd fixed the fence and the cellar and gotten the stores in before the storm." He paused. "There were some other comments." "What kind of comments?" Martha said. Silas met her eyes. "The kind that people make when they're surprised," he said evenly. "The kind about your size." Martha held his gaze and said nothing. "Cole Fenwick's wife put a stop to it," Silas said. "Sarah Fenwick. She told the room that she didn't care what the woman looked like if she'd done what people were saying she'd done." He picked up his coffee. "I thought you should know that." Martha was quiet for a moment. She'd been expecting something like this. Not the particulars, but the shape of it. She'd lived inside that particular shape her whole life and knew its dimensions intimately. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "I should have said something sooner," Silas said, "about when you arrived. The way I—" He stopped. "I know what you thought when you saw me," Martha said. She said it without anger because she didn't have anger for it, not now. She'd processed it before he'd even unlatched the gate. "You thought I wouldn't be able to do the work." He didn't look away from her. "Yes," he said. "You were wrong," she said. "I know," he said. "I was wrong." There was a silence that was not comfortable and not uncomfortable, but was the kind that had weight in it, the kind that happened when 2 people were being honest with each other about something that deserved honesty. "It's not the first time someone thought that," Martha said. "It won't be the last." "That doesn't make it right," Silas said. She looked at him. This lean, weathered, plain-spoken man who had handed her 50 cents a week, and room and board, and a ranch that needed fixing, and who was now sitting at his own kitchen table telling her he'd been wrong about her, straightforwardly, without dressing it up. She hadn't expected that. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She picked up the bread knife and went back to slicing. "Tell Cole Fenwick I'll come with you when you collect the hog." Sarah Fenwick was a small, sharp-featured woman of about 40 who had the particular energy of someone who had been managing too many things for too long and had developed a kind of kinetic efficiency as a result. She didn't walk across a room, she covered it, accomplishing 3 things on the way. She met Martha at the wagon before Silas had even set the brake, and she looked at her with a directness that Martha found immediately restful after years of dealing with people who looked sideways. "You're the one who fixed the east fence," Sarah said. Not a question. "I fixed a lot of things," Martha said. "Good," Sarah said. "Come inside. I want to ask you about something." She turned and went back toward the house at her covering-the-room pace. Martha climbed down from the wagon and followed. Behind her, she heard Silas say something to Cole Fenwick, and Cole Fenwick laugh, which was a sound she hadn't heard from that direction before. The Fenwick kitchen was smaller than Iron Bluff's and more crowded. 3 children in various states of Saturday liberty, a baby on a blanket by the stove, evidence of a household that was operating at the very edge of its capacity in terms of both space and resources. Martha took it in quickly, the same inventory she ran everywhere. The baby was thin. The bread on the counter was good bread, but not enough of it. The children's clothes were mended well, but mended often. "Sit down," Sarah said, moving the baby to her hip in a motion that had the quality of long habit. "I want to know about the carrot beds." Martha sat. "What about them?" "You pulled 3 beds in one afternoon," Sarah said, "before the storm." "They were ready to come up," Martha said, "and the storm was coming." "How did you know?" Martha explained about the sky, the wind direction, the pressure change she'd felt in her ears. Sarah listened with the attention of someone taking notes, even though she wasn't writing anything down. "We lost our turnips," Sarah said. When she said it, there was nothing dramatic in her voice, just the flat statement of it, the way farmers talked about losses. Directly, without embellishment, because embellishment was a luxury for people who didn't have to live with the thing. "I knew the storm was coming, but I thought we had more time." "The color of the sky," Martha said. "That greenish light about 3 hours before it hit." "I saw that," Sarah said. "I thought it was just the cloud cover." "It's the cloud height," Martha said. "When you get that color, it means the clouds are very high and very heavy. You've usually got 2 to 3 hours, not more." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. The baby reached up and grabbed a fistful of her collar. Sarah absently moved the baby's hand without looking at it. "I want to learn that," she said. "I can show you," Martha said. That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with anything deliberate, just with 2 women at a kitchen table in a struggling farmhouse on a cold October morning, one of them asking a question and the other one answering it. By the time Silas and Cole came in from loading the hog, Martha and Sarah Fenwick were deep in a conversation about root vegetable storage that had already covered 3 different methods. Martha's mother had brought from Bavaria, and 2 that Sarah had learned from her own grandmother in Missouri. The baby had fallen asleep on the blanket again. One of the children had silently appeared and was sitting at the end of the table eating a piece of bread and listening. Silas looked at Martha with an expression she couldn't read, and then looked at Cole with an expression Cole apparently could read because Cole smiled at it. Winter arrived without much preamble at the beginning of November, as if it had been waiting just over the horizon and had decided it had been patient long enough. The first hard frost came overnight on a Thursday and killed everything still in the ground across the valley, which at Iron Bluff Ranch was nothing, because Martha had been pulling the last of the kitchen garden by lamplight the Wednesday before, nagged by the same feeling in her ears that had told her about the storm in August. The cellar was as full as it was going to be. Not as full as she wanted it, but full enough if they were careful, and Martha had been thinking about careful for weeks. She had also, quietly, been paying attention to the other ranches. It was easy enough to do. People talked, Sarah Fenwick talked especially, and the web of information that passed between farm wives in a valley was dense and specific and far more accurate than anything the men tended to know about each other's actual situations. Martha had learned, through Sarah, that the Halbert place was all right. Old Tom Halbert was tight-fisted to the point of compulsion and had stores that would outlast most, though his farm hands were underpaid to the point where 2 of them might not stay through spring. The Wickham family 2 miles south had had a disastrous corn crop and were already rationing before December. The Garrity brothers, who ran a cattle operation 4 miles north, had lost 9 head to a sickness in October that nobody had identified and everyone was nervous about. Martha had told Silas all of this, not as gossip, but as information, laid out the way she laid out her cellar notes, systematically, with the relevant quantities and the likely timelines. He had listened, which she now understood was not something he did automatically. Silas Mercer listened selectively to things he'd decided were worth his attention and she had been watching the category of things worth his attention quietly expand since August. "The Wickhams are going to run out before February," she said, on a Sunday evening in the third week of November, when the first real winter cold had settled and the house had taken on the particular sealed-in quality of a Kansas winter. "At what they're rationing to, they'll be out of flour by January and salt pork by February, and the children—" She stopped. "How many children?" Silas said. "4, Martha said. "Youngest is about 3. Silas sat with his coffee. Outside, the wind was doing what it did in November. Not violent, just relentless. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself loudly, but just pressed in steadily through every gap and crack. "We're not overflowing," he said. "No," Martha agreed. "But we're not going to starve either, and we've got the lard from the Fenwick hog, and I've been calculating the flour. And if we're careful, if we're actually careful, Silas, not just trying to be, we've got enough to share something." He looked at her. "Something," he said. "Not everything, not enough to fix it, but enough that they don't lose the youngest 2 to cold and hunger by February, which is what's going to happen otherwise." She held his gaze. "That's not a guess. That's an estimate based on what Sarah told me their stores look like and how many mouths they're feeding." Silas was quiet for a while. The stove ticked. From upstairs came the sound of Thomas moving around his room, the creak of the floor that Martha had been meaning to fix and hadn't gotten to yet. "You want to take food to the Wickhams," Silas said. "I want us to figure out what we can spare," Martha said, "and then decide." "Who else?" "Sarah Fenwick already has a better handle on things since we talked," Martha said. "The Halberts are fine, the Garrity brothers." She made a small gesture. "They can manage. The Wickhams are the worst of it that I can see." Silas set his coffee down and looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, those long-fingered, work-worn hands that were always slightly rough no matter how cold the weather got. "Anna would have done this already," he said, very quietly. Not sad or not entirely, more like he was locating himself against something. She'd have been at the Wickhams in October. Martha didn't say anything. "She didn't ask me first either," he said. "She'd just do it and tell me after." He looked up. "I'm not saying that was wrong. I'm saying, I noticed that you're asking." Martha thought about how to answer that. "She knew you well enough to know you'd be all right with it," she said carefully. "I don't know you that well yet." Something shifted in Silas's face. "You know me pretty well," he said. And it wasn't a challenge, not quite. More like an observation, offered flatly, the way he offered most observations. Martha looked at him across the table. 10 weeks. She had been at Iron Bluff Ranch for 10 weeks, and she knew the sound of his boots on the stairs in the morning, and the way he paused at doorways, and the particular set of his jaw when he was worried about money, and the way he called Thomas's name when he was exasperated, Thomas William Mercer, and the way he held his coffee cup with both hands on cold mornings, and the fact that he had, quietly, started leaving the barn lantern on the hook by the back door instead of in the barn, because she'd once had to search for it in the dark. "All right," she said. "Will you be all right with it?" He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "Take what we can spare." She had the list ready. She'd been working on it for a week. She slid it across the table and he looked at it and didn't say anything, which meant he agreed with the quantities or was choosing to trust them. "I'll go with you," he said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." They went on Tuesday, with the wagon loaded and Thomas sitting in the back wrapped in 2 quilts because he had refused to stay home and neither of them had pushed it very hard. The Wickham place was a difficult thing to look at. Not because it was ruined, it wasn't, or not yet, but because you could see precisely how close it was to becoming ruined, the particular accumulation of small failures that came from people who were working desperately hard and still losing ground. 3 of the children appeared at the door before the wagon stopped, and they had that look that Martha had seen before and hated, the look of children who had learned to track arrivals because arrivals sometimes meant food. Ruth Wickham met them at the door. She was Martha's age, maybe a year younger, and she looked 10 years older, and she looked at the wagon with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite making it. "Silas Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. "Ruth," Silas said. "We had more than we needed." Martha thought. "We worked it out together," Martha said, because she'd heard the way he was going to phrase it, and she didn't want Ruth Wickham to feel like charity, which was different from help, and mattered in a way that people who'd never needed either sometimes didn't understand. Ruth looked at Martha. She'd heard of her clearly. Martha could see it in the quick, involuntary assessment of her eyes, the same arithmetic that everyone ran, and then the conscious setting aside of it, a visible decision that Martha found she respected more than she could say. "Come in," Ruth said. "It's cold." They stayed an hour. In that hour, Martha looked at the Wickham kitchen with the same inventory she ran everywhere and quietly identified 4 things she could teach Ruth before the worst of winter. 4 things that would stretch what they had further than Ruth knew it could stretch. She didn't make a production of it. She just started talking, the way women talked across kitchen tables, naturally and without ceremony, about flour and lard and the things her mother had done to make a little food go a long way. Ruth Wickham's youngest, who was 3 and had his mother's eyes and a persistent runny nose, climbed onto the bench next to Martha at some point and leaned against her arm with the boneless trust of small children who hadn't yet learned to calculate whether people were safe. Martha looked down at him. She felt that ache again, sharper this time, less controlled. She breathed through it. Thomas, from across the table, caught her eye. He looked at the small child leaning against her arm and then at Martha's face, and he had that uncanny perceptiveness of his that sometimes felt like more than an 8-year-old should have. He said nothing. But when they left an hour later and climbed back into the wagon, he sat in the back as before, and after a few minutes he moved forward and sat beside Martha on the bench, without being asked, and leaned slightly against her arm, the same way the Wickham child had. Martha looked straight ahead at the winter road. She kept her voice steady when she said, "You'll be cold up here." "I have 2 quilts," Thomas said, and pulled one of them around them both, and that was the end of that conversation. Silas, on the other side of Martha, had seen all of it. He kept his eyes on the road. The horse moved steadily through the gray November afternoon, and the cold pressed down from the enormous Kansas sky. And the 3 of them sat shoulder to shoulder on the wagon bench with a quilt across 2 of them, and nobody said much of anything. But the silence was the good kind, the kind that had stopped being empty chat. December came, and with it the news that the Garrity brothers had lost 3 more cattle and were talking about selling the operation in spring, and that a family Martha didn't know, the Calder family, had abandoned their homestead 30 miles east and headed back to Illinois, and that the winter was not going to get easier before it got worse. Martha sat with her notes on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, and she looked at the numbers with the honesty they deserved. They were going to be all right. She still believed that. But all right required continuing to be careful in ways that were going to demand something from both of them. She looked up to find Silas watching her from across the kitchen. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just, you look like your mother must have looked," he said, "when she was working something out." Martha stared at him. "You never met my mother." "No," he said, "but Thomas described her to me." "Thomas has never met her either," Martha said. "No," Silas said, "but you have. And Thomas pays more attention than people realize." He picked up his coffee. "He said you get a particular look when you're figuring something out. He said it was the same one in the photograph you keep on your windowsill." Martha was quiet for a moment. She hadn't known anyone had noticed the photograph. "What did he say she looked like?" she asked. Silas thought about it. "He said she looked like she could fix anything," he said, "if you gave her enough time." Martha looked back down at her notes. Her mother at 12, alone on a ship, with 2 dead parents and a cousin's address on a piece of paper. Her mother at 30, at a kitchen table in Kansas, teaching Martha to read the sky. Her mother at 50, with hands that had never quite stopped working, who had looked at every hard thing that came her way and said, not out loud, never out loud, because that was not how she operated. "I'm still here. What needs doing?" Martha looked at the notes. She knew what needed doing. She picked up her pencil and kept working, and the stove ticked in the cold kitchen, and outside the Kansas winter pressed down, dark and serious and entirely indifferent, the way it always had, the way it always would. And Iron Bluff Ranch held. The coldest week came in January without warning, the way the worst things always did. Not the slow-building cold of December, which had been serious but manageable, the kind of cold that gave you time to adjust and add a layer and put an extra log on the fire. This was different. This was the kind of cold that arrived overnight and sat on the valley like something deliberate, dropping temperatures so fast that the water in the barn trough iced over between Martha's evening check and her morning one, and the gap was only 8 hours. She found it at 5:30 in the morning before anyone else was up. Broke the ice with the iron handle of the mallet she'd started keeping by the barn door in November, a habit formed from the same instinct that made her check the cellar latch and read the northwest sky. Small preparations made in advance of things you hoped wouldn't happen. The animals were restless in that specific way they got when the temperature was doing something serious, shifting their weight, breathing visible clouds, their eyes showing more white than usual. She topped up the water, broke the ice in the second trough, checked the hay, and stood in the barn door for a moment looking at the sky. It was clear. That was the problem. In winter on the Kansas plain, clear sky meant cold was coming in from the north without anything to slow it down. No cloud cover, no moisture, just that vast open corridor of Arctic air moving south with nothing to stop it. The stars were the kind of hard, sharp bright that only happened when the temperature was already well below zero and dropping. She went back to the house and put 2 extra logs on the kitchen stove. By breakfast, the thermometer nailed to the outside wall of the barn read 15 below. Silas saw it on his way out and came back inside without saying anything, which told Martha everything. He sat at the table and drank his coffee, and they looked at each other across the kitchen and ran the same calculation simultaneously, which they'd gotten in the habit of doing without acknowledging they were doing it. "The cellar will hold temperature," Martha said, "but the root vegetables on the north side are going to freeze if it stays this cold for more than 2 days. "How do you know it'll be more than 2 days?" Thomas asked. He was eating his porridge with the focused efficiency he applied to most things, but his eyes were moving between them the way they did when he was tracking something that mattered. "That sky," Martha said. Thomas looked out the window, then back at her. "The clear one?" "Clear and no wind," she said. "When the wind drops in January like this, it usually means the system has settled in. It's not passing through, it's sitting." Silas set his cup down. "I'll move the north side stores to the center before noon." "I'll help," Thomas said. "You have lessons," Silas said. Thomas opened his mouth. "You can help after lessons," Martha said, before whatever he'd been preparing could get out. "The cellar will still need work in the afternoon." Thomas closed his mouth, apparently finding this acceptable. Silas looked at Martha with an expression that had something at the back of it that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. She'd gotten better at reading that neighborhood over 4 months. The cold held for 5 days. On the second day, the Fennec boy arrived on horseback. He was 16 and rode like he'd been doing it since before he could walk, which he probably had, with a message from Sarah. The message was that the Wickham family's stove had cracked. The iron firebox, which had apparently been repaired twice already with questionable materials, had given out completely in the night, and they were heating the house with the kitchen fireplace alone, which in 15 below temperatures with 4 children was not a sustainable situation. Martha read the note twice. Then she went to find Silas. He was in the cellar, moving the north side root vegetables to the center shelving. The way he'd said, Thomas beside him carrying armloads of turnips with the excessive seriousness he brought to physical tasks. "The Wickham stove is gone," Martha said. Silas stopped. "Gone how?" "The firebox cracked. They've got the fireplace and nothing else." I was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the same inventory she'd already run in her head, what they had, what they could spare, what was possible. "We've got the small stove from the bunkhouse," he said. "Dell took the big one to his mother's place in October, but the small one's still in there." "Does it work?" "Last I checked, it did. That was September." "I'll look at it," Martha said. "If it's sound, we can take it to the Wickhams. They need something they can actually cook on, not just a fireplace." Silas was already coming up the cellar stairs. "I'll get the wagon hitched." "In 15 below," Martha said. "You want to leave those children without heat," he said flatly, pulling on his coat. "No," Martha said. "I'm saying bundle Thomas up." "I'm going too," Thomas said from the cellar stairs behind them. Neither of them argued. The bunkhouse stove was small but sound. Martha checked the firebox plates, the flue connections, the door seal, the legs, all of it, in about 10 minutes while her breath made clouds in the unheated room and her fingers went numb inside her gloves. A small crack in the flue elbow that she packed with wet ash and clay from the barn floor, the old farmwife's repair that held better than people expected. She tested the draw with a piece of paper and it pulled correctly. "It'll work," she said. Loading a cast iron stove onto a wagon in 15 below temperatures with a 40-minute drive ahead was the kind of task that tested everyone's patience and several of Silas's more creatively assembled sentences. The stove weighed better than 200 pounds. They got it up on boards and then up a ramp of same, all three of them plus the Fenwick boy, who had waited in case there was a reply to the note. And by the time it was in the wagon bed, all four of them were sweating inside their coats despite the cold. Martha climbed up on the wagon bench and tucked the quilt over Thomas, who had taken his position beside her with the settled manner of someone who considered this his rightful seat. "Your hands are blue," he said. "They're cold," Martha said. "That's what blue means," he said. "I know what it means," Martha said. He very deliberately took her hands and put them under the quilt with his, which she let him do because her hands were, in fact, cold. And because there was something about the matter-of-fact way he did things like this that made refusing them feel like the wrong kind of pride. They drove in silence for the first mile. The cold was the kind that reached inside your coat no matter how well you'd fastened it, finding the spaces at your wrists and collar. The horse moved steadily, which Martha was grateful for. She'd learned that about this horse, a bay gelding named August, who Silas had owned for 6 years, that he was unflappable in bad weather, committed to forward motion in a way that was almost philosophical. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "You can ask me anything," Martha said. He thought about how to phrase it. She could feel him thinking about it beside her. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. "After the harvest. You came for harvest work, but the harvest is done, and you're still here. Are you going to stay all winter?" Martha looked at the road ahead. "I'm here through the winter," she said. "Your father and I agreed on that." "What about after winter?" Thomas said. She felt Silas shift slightly on the other side of her. He was listening, but looking straight ahead. "I don't know yet," Martha said, because it was the truth, and she'd decided she would always tell Thomas the truth, even when it was complicated. Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing. "Do you want to?" he said. Martha looked at the road. The sky was hard and blue, and the winter prairie stretched away in every direction, flat and enormous and entirely without mercy. She had been in this place for 4 months. She had fixed the cellar latch and the east fence and the bunkhouse stove and 30 other things she'd stopped counting. She had put food on the table 3 times a day. She had pulled carrots in a coming storm and sat in a cellar with this child while the sky tried to take the roof off, and taught him to mend a shirt and talk to his father across a kitchen table until both of them ran out of words and sat in the silence that had come to feel like its own kind of conversation. "Yes," she said, "I want to." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. He kept her hands under the quilt until they got to the Wickhams. The Wickham house was cold in a way that was painful to walk into, which was the wrong direction from how it was supposed to work. The fireplace in the main room had a good fire in it, but the heat was getting eaten by the walls and the ceiling and the inadequacy of a single hearth, trying to warm what a stove could not. Ruth Wickham met them at the door with the youngest on her hip, and her jaw set in the precise way that people set their jaws when they were not going to let themselves fall apart in front of company. "You didn't have to," she started. "We had an extra," Martha said. "Help us get it in." They got it in. It took the better part of 2 hours to move the old broken stove out, connect the bunkhouse stove to the existing flue, which required some improvisation with stovepipe lengths that Martha directed, and Silas executed with the focused competence he applied to physical problems, which was more reliable than the way he applied it to most other kinds of problems, and get it drawing properly. Martha built the first fire in it herself, feeding it small and careful, watching the draw, making sure the improvised flue connection wasn't backing up. It held. The first warmth began coming off the iron within 20 minutes. The 3 Wickham children who were old enough to understand what was happening stood in a row and watched it with an intensity that Martha found almost impossible to look at directly. Ruth Wickham, standing behind them, put her free hand over her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she took it away and said practically, "I'll put water on." Thomas, who had been an extraordinary model of restrained 8-year-old energy for the entire trip, found the youngest Wickham child and began an extensive negotiation about something that appeared to involve a wooden horse and a very small piece of string. Martha listened to it for a moment and thought about what it meant that he could do that. Walk into a cold and frightened house and find the smallest person in it and give them something to do with their hands. It was something she recognized. He'd gotten it from somewhere, and she thought she knew where, and it was not from her. Anna Mercer, again. Still present in the actions of her son, 4 years after she was gone. Martha looked at Silas across the room. He was finishing the flue connection, not looking at her. But he'd done it. He'd hitched the wagon in 15 below and driven 40 minutes in the cold and lifted a 200-pound stove and spent 2 hours on his knees connecting pipe in a cold house. Not because he'd been asked, because the children needed heat. She looked away before he could catch her looking. The thaw, when it finally came in the third week of January, was almost violent in its abruptness, temperatures climbing 20 degrees in a single day, the snow on the roof beginning to run, the yard becoming the particular treacherous mud of a winter thaw that froze again at night and thawed again by noon. Martha came in from the barn one morning to find 2 wagons in the yard that hadn't been there when she'd gone out. She stopped. Old Tom Halbert was at the kitchen door, which was already open, talking to Silas. Behind him, his farmhand was holding the reins of both teams. In the wagon beds, Martha could see sacks, flour, by the look of them, and what appeared to be a side of smoked meat. She came across the yard. Tom Halbert was 70 at least, with a face like old leather and eyes that were sharper than his movements suggested. He had a reputation in the valley for being close with money, which was fair, he was. But Martha had been around long enough to understand that close with money and close with everything were different things in different people. Miss Ellsworth, he said. He'd been calling her that since the day Sarah Fenwick had introduced them in October, and he said it with a formality that meant respect, which she'd decided to accept as such. Mr. Halbert, she said, what's this? Heard you took the bunkhouse stove to the Wickhams, he said. We did, she said. Heard you went out in 15 below to do it. The children needed heat, Martha said. He looked at her for a moment with those sharp eyes. Then he looked at Silas, then back at Martha. I've got flour I'm not going to use, he said, and a smoked ham that's more than my man and I will eat before spring. He said it gruffly, with the manner of a man who is doing something kind and would prefer not to have to admit it too loudly. Thought you might know who needs it. Martha kept her face neutral because she understood exactly what he was doing and why, and she understood that making too much of it would make it harder for him to do it. I might know 1 or 2 places, she said. Figured, Halbert said. He looked at Silas again. You've got a good woman here, Mercer. He said it flatly, matter of fact, the way he might observe that a fence was well built. I didn't think so when I heard about her. I'll admit that plainly. Silas said nothing. Martha saw the set of his jaw. I was wrong, Halbert said. Just as plain. He touched the brim of his hat in Martha's direction and turned back to his wagon. You'll know where the flour needs to go better than I do. They watched him drive out. Silas was looking at the wagons in the yard. 2 teams, 2 loads, a winter thaw that had made the roads just passable. His jaw was still set. Are you all right? Martha asked. I was right, Silas said. About being wrong. He wasn't looking at her. I was wrong about you the same way. You hired me, Martha said. I hired you because I was desperate, Silas said, and because you were standing at my gate and I needed a body that could work. That's not the same as... He stopped. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the assessments, not the calculations, not even the gratitude that had been building incrementally since August. Something more direct than any of that, and more uncomfortable. I didn't see you, he said. Not that first day. Not for a while after it. I saw what I expected to see, and I let that be enough. He shook his head slightly. My son saw you clearer than I did, and he's 8 years old. Martha held his gaze. The winter sun was thin and bright in the thaw air, and it lit the yard between them in a way that left nowhere to hide. You came around, she said. Not fast enough, he said. Fast enough, she said. People don't see each other all at once. It takes time. That's not a failing, Silas. That's just how it works. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the wagons Tom Halbert had left. I'll get August hitched, he said. We'll take the Wickhams the ham. The flour? Sarah Fenwick will know who needs the flour, Martha said. He nodded. I'll be ready in 20 minutes. He went to the barn, and Martha went to the kitchen, and she stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Something was changing. She could feel it the way she felt the weather change, in her ears, in the pressure of the air around her, in some sense she didn't have a clean word for. Something was shifting at Iron Bluff Ranch between the two of them, in the specific space across a kitchen table where they had been sitting for 4 months, talking about cellar stores and fence posts and the Wickham children and how Thomas was progressing with his mending. She wasn't sure what to do with it yet. She got her coat. They took the ham to the Wickhams and the flour to Sarah Fenwick, and on the way back through the valley, they stopped twice. Once because Silas saw something in a fence line of the abandoned Calder property that he wanted to check, and once because Thomas, who had come again as a matter of established principle, spotted what he claimed was a red-tailed hawk and what turned out to be a very large stick. Thomas was aggrieved about the stick. "It moved," he said. "Sticks don't move," Silas said. "It moved," Thomas repeated, with the conviction of someone who knows what they saw and is not going to be dissuaded by mere reality. Martha said nothing, which was the correct response, and after a moment Thomas climbed back into the wagon and arranged himself between them with the dignity of a person who has been wronged but is choosing to be adult about it. "The hawk was probably nearby," Martha said after a mile. Thomas looked at her. "You think? Red tails like that kind of open fence line," she said. "He was probably there. You just found the wrong thing to look at." Thomas considered this. "So I wasn't wrong. I was just adjacent." "Adjacent," Silas said. "Adjacent," Thomas confirmed. He seemed satisfied with this. He leaned against Martha's arm in the way he'd been doing for months now, and she put the quilt over him without being asked. Silas watched the road. "Adjacent," he said again, very quietly, and Martha thought she heard something in it that wasn't about the hawk at all. The first week of February brought something she hadn't expected: visitors. Not one or two, she'd gotten used to one or two, to Sarah Fenwick or Ruth Wickham arriving with a question or a problem, to Tom Halbert sending his farmhand over with something or other. This was different. This was on a Tuesday morning, 4 different families in the space of 3 hours, all arriving separately, all with questions. The Garrity brothers wanted to know about the moisture damage in the cellar wall. They'd found the same problem in their own root cellar and had heard, through the compressed telephone of valley gossip, that Martha had dealt with it at Iron Bluff. A woman named Clara Bauer, who had a homestead 6 miles east with her husband and her mother-in-law, wanted to know about the food stretching methods Martha had described to Ruth Wickham, which Ruth had apparently described to someone else, who had described them to Clara. A young man of about 25 named Henry Marsh, who was attempting to ranch alone on his late father's property and was clearly in over his head in several specific ways, came with a list of problems so long that Martha told him to come back Thursday, and they would go through it properly. The Wickhams themselves came in the afternoon, not with a problem, but with a jar of something preserved that Ruth had made from the last of their summer berries, which she set on Martha's kitchen table and did not make a speech about. Martha did not make a speech about it either. She made coffee, and they sat at the table and talked practically about what the rest of the winter was going to look like for various people in the valley. And Martha found herself doing something she recognized from watching her mother do it. Not so much giving advice as asking the right questions in the right order, so that the person across the table arrived at their own answer and felt the better for it. Silas came in from the barn in the middle of the afternoon and stopped when he saw the kitchen. 3 conversations happening simultaneously. Children he didn't know sitting on his kitchen floor playing with Thomas's blocks. Clara Bauer's elderly mother-in-law in his favorite chair by the stove, with a cup of coffee and an expression of absolute contentment. He looked at Martha across the room. She looked back with an expression that she intended to communicate, "I know, I'm sorry, it got away from me," and that apparently communicated something else, because something in his face did something complicated. He hung up his coat, poured himself a coffee, and sat down at the edge of the table and participated. She watched him do it and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, something that she'd packed away carefully years ago when it had become clear that the world was going to be what it was and not what she'd hoped. She didn't name it. Not yet. She just noted its presence, the way she noted things, and moved on. By evening, when everyone had gone and Thomas was upstairs and the kitchen was quiet again, Silas sat at the table with his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the room. "This used to be the quietest house in the valley," he said. "Is that a complaint?" Martha asked. She was washing the cups, her back to him. "No," he said. After a pause, "No, it's not." She kept washing. "Anna used to bring people in like this," he said. Quietly, the way he always said her name. Not painfully anymore. Or not only painfully. More like the way you pressed on a bruise to find out whether it still hurt, and discovered the hurt had changed to something else. She had a way of making people feel like whatever room she was in was where they ought to be. Martha said nothing. "I didn't know how much of it was her," he said. "I thought it was the house. Or just the way things were." He stopped. "It wasn't," obviously. Sometimes it's both, Martha said. The person and the place. Maybe, he said. She finished the last cup and dried her hands and turned around. He was looking at the table, at the grain of the wood, his coffee cooling in front of him. Silas, she said. He looked up. She didn't know, quite, what she wanted to say. She'd been in this kitchen for 4.5 months, and she'd fixed more things than she'd kept count of, and she'd fed this man and his son more than 200 meals, and she'd sat across from him at this table in the evenings and watched his face learn how to carry less of its weight, and none of that had a category she could put it in cleanly. You built a good house, she said. He looked at her. When you built it, she said, you built it solid. It held through everything this winter, and it'll hold next winter, and the one after, whatever else. You built a good house. He was very still. I didn't build it alone, he said. I know, she said, but you chose it. The land, the foundation, the way you set the posts, that was you. She held his gaze. Anna furnished it. I fixed some of the things that needed fixing, but the house is yours, Silas. That's not nothing. He looked at her for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the February night was cold, but not brutal, the worst of the winter having finally said what it needed to say. It's bigger than it needs to be, he said. His voice was strange, careful, like a man walking on ice and not sure yet where his weight is safe. For 2 people. Martha kept her face neutral. You have 3 rooms upstairs, she said, and a bunkhouse that's currently heated by a missing stove. Yes, he said. A silence. Martha, he said. Silas, she said. He stopped. Started again. I'm not good at... He shook his head. I'm not good at this part. I know, she said. I don't want you to leave, he said. In spring, or ever. I don't want you to leave. He said it the way he said difficult things, flatly and directly and without dressing it up, because dressing things up was not his way. I know that's not a... I know you're here as an employee, and I know I have no right to... Silas, Martha said. He stopped. I fixed the cellar latch the first morning, she said, before anyone had asked me to, before I had any reason to take care of this place's problems beyond the job I'd been hired to do. He was listening. I've been fixing things that weren't in any agreement we made, she said. I've been doing it because I wanted to, because this place... She stopped, breathed, because this felt like somewhere worth taking care of. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't want to leave either, she said. He looked at her across his kitchen table, this man she had known for 4.5 months, and not known at all, and known very well, this quiet, difficult, decent man who had been carrying his grief the way you carried a stone in your boot, and had gradually, over the course of a winter, been putting it down. All right, he said. His voice was rough. All right. She sat back down at the table, and he slid his coffee across to her because hers had gone cold, and she took it, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the February night pressed against the windows, and the house held around them the way it had always held, solid on its foundation. March arrived with the particular violence of a Kansas spring trying to assert itself against the last of winter's stubbornness. 3 days of warm, clear weather, followed by a late snow, followed by warm again, followed by another hard frost that killed the first tentative shoots in the kitchen garden and made Martha rework her planting schedule for the second time. She did it without complaint, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook, Thomas at her elbow doing the arithmetic she gave him. If we lose 10 days on the carrots, Thomas said, running the column with the seriousness he applied to numbers, and the beans start 2 weeks late. We move things around, Martha said. The south beds get planted first this year. They warm fastest. I know, Thomas said, because the bluff blocks the north wind. That's right. He wrote something in the notebook. Can I plant the south beds, he said. By myself. Martha looked at him. He was 9 now. His birthday had been in February, a fact she'd discovered approximately 48 hours before it happened, and had responded to by making the elaborate German cake her mother had always made for birthdays, a recipe she'd been carrying in her head for 20 years and had not expected to use. Silas had looked at the cake and then at Martha with an expression that she'd put away carefully to look at later, in private, because there was too much in it to process with other people in the room. Show me your plan, she said. Thomas showed her his plan. It was mostly correct. The spacing on the bean rows was slightly off, which she corrected, and he'd forgotten to account for the drainage slope on the east end of the south bed, which she showed him, and once those two things were addressed, the plan was sound. "Yes," she said, "you can plant the south beds." Thomas looked up at her with an expression that was trying not to be as pleased as it was and not quite managing it. "By myself," he confirmed. "By yourself," she confirmed. "I'll check the spacing after." He went back to the notebook, and Martha watched him write his corrected plan with that serious tongue at the corner of the mouth concentration, and felt the ache again. Not the sharp, painful kind she'd been managing all winter, but something softer. Something that felt less like loss and more like finding. She'd written to her sister in December. A proper letter, 4 pages, which was the most she'd written at one go in years. She'd told her sister about Thomas, and about the storm, and about the cellar, and about the Wickhams, and about Silas in careful, measured language that she'd revised 3 times before sealing. Her sister had written back in January, a letter so full of questions that Martha had laughed reading it, which was something she hadn't done alone in a long time. She'd written back. She was working on the 3rd letter now. She was trying to explain what it felt like to be somewhere that needed exactly who she was. She was finding it difficult to articulate in a way that didn't sound like she was making too much of things, which was her particular tendency and one she was aware of. Her sister, in her 2nd letter, had written, "Martha, stop trying to describe it sensibly. Just tell me if you're happy." Martha had looked at that question for a long time. She had thought about the cellar latch, first morning, before sunrise, the carrots in the storm, Thomas on the wagon bench with her hands under the quilt, Silas saying, "I don't want you to leave," in that rough, direct, undressed way of his. She had written back, "Yes, I think I am." The day Dell came back in April. He'd spent the winter with his family and had agreed with Silas in the fall to return for planting. Was the day Martha understood something had settled permanently. He arrived in the morning, tied his horse at the post, and came to the kitchen door. Martha opened it. He stood there with his hat in his hands and the expression of a young man who had spent some portion of the winter thinking about something and was now going to say a thing about it. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. "Dell," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "Last summer, about the fence. I told Thomas you didn't know what you were doing, and I was—" He stopped, reset, continued. "I was wrong about that." Martha looked at him. He was 21 now, maybe, and the winter had done something slightly different to his face. Less unfinished, more settled. He met her eyes, which he hadn't done particularly reliably the previous summer. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. She meant it. He nodded, put his hat back on, and went to find Silas. Martha stood in the kitchen door for a moment in the April morning, the air carrying the smell of wet earth and the promise of things that were about to grow, and she looked out at the yard, the east fence she'd rebuilt, the cellar door that latched properly, the kitchen garden with Thomas's carefully staked row markers, where the south bed planting was already planned and partially underway. Tom Halbert's flour had gone to 3 families through the winter. The Wickhams had made it through with the bunkhouse stove and were planning their spring planting with something Martha would not quite call optimism, but that was closer to it than they'd been in October. Sarah Fenwick had come by twice in March to show Martha something she'd worked out about cold storage preservation that built on what Martha had taught her, and the second time she'd brought her oldest daughter, who was 12 and sharp-eyed, and had sat at the table listening to both of them with the focused attention of someone storing things for later. The valley had made it through the winter. Not easily, and not without losses. The Garrity's had sold half their cattle in February, and the Calder property sat abandoned and would probably stay that way. But the families that were here were still here, and some of them were here partly because of what had happened at Iron Bluff Ranch through the fall and winter, and Martha did not take credit for that in any way she would have said out loud. But she knew it. She kept it quietly, the way she kept most things. Silas came out of the barn and saw her standing in the kitchen door and crossed the yard to her, August the horse following at a slight distance the way he sometimes did with Silas, like a large, independent-minded shadow. "Dell's back," he said. "I know," she said. He apologized. Silas raised his eyebrows slightly. "What for?" "The fence," she said. "Last summer." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good." They stood in the kitchen door together, looking at the yard in the April morning. The sky was the particular tentative blue of early spring, not yet committed to anything, still hedging its bets. A meadowlark was making a case for itself from somewhere in the direction of the bluff. "I need to talk to you about something," Silas said. Martha waited. I was doing the thing he did when he was going to say something difficult, turning his hat brim slightly, the only part of him that moved when the rest was still. I've been talking to Pastor Ames in Holbrook, he said. Martha looked at him. About what? He looked at her. His pale gray eyes, in the morning light, were the color of the sky when it finally committed to something. About whether he'd marry us, Silas said. If you were willing. The meadowlark made its case again, somewhere toward the bluff. August snorted at something in the grass. Martha looked at Silas Mercer and thought about $17 and a worn-out trunk and 11 words on a strip of yellow paper. She thought about her mother at 12, alone on a ship. She thought about the cellar latch, first morning, before sunrise. She thought about Thomas's hands putting hers under the quilt on the wagon bench, matter-of-fact and certain, as if this was simply what you did when someone's hands were cold. You should have asked me first, she said, before you talked to the pastor. He looked at her. I know, he said. I did it backward. Yes, she said. You did. A silence. I'm asking now, he said. Martha looked at the yard. The east fence, solid on its new posts. The kitchen garden, waiting. The bluff, reddish and low and permanent against the spring sky. Yes, she said. Silas let out a breath. She hadn't known he was holding one. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood there in the April morning, not touching, not saying anything more, looking at the yard that was both of theirs now, in a way it hadn't quite been yesterday. And the meadowlark sang from the bluff, and the sky made up its mind to be blue, and the ranch held around them, solid on its foundation, the way it always had. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of May, which was not the most convenient time given that planting was underway, and Dell was managing the north field, and Thomas had strong opinions about whether he should have to wear his good shirt on a day that was not a Sunday. He wore the good shirt. He made his position on the matter known, clearly and at some length, on Friday evening, and Martha listened to all of it with the patience she'd been developing since September, and then she said, The shirt goes on tomorrow. That's not negotiable. Everything else about the day you can have an opinion about. Thomas considered this division of authority. What else can I have an opinion about? The flowers, Martha said, if you want to put some on the table, and whether we have the cake before or after the meal. Before, Thomas said immediately. I figured, Martha said. He wore the shirt without complaint. The ceremony itself was small, which was what both of them had wanted without either of them having had to negotiate it, because they'd each arrived at the same conclusion independently, and then confirmed it in about 30 seconds of conversation. Pastor Ames, the Fenwicks, the Wickhams, Tom Halbert, and Dell, who stood in the back of the small Holbrook church with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a young man who was feeling something he hadn't anticipated feeling and wasn't sure what to do about it. Martha wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that her mother had made the fabric for, and Martha had sewn herself years ago in Ohio, on a winter afternoon when she'd been certain she'd never have occasion to wear it. She'd brought it in the trunk. She'd almost left it behind twice in the last year because it took up space she could have used for practical things, and both times she'd packed it back in anyway, for reasons she hadn't examined too closely. She examined them now, standing at the back of the church in the May morning light, holding a small handful of prairie flowers that Sarah Fenwick's daughter had picked and pressed into her hands with an expression of profound ceremonial seriousness. She examined them and found they were simple. She had brought the dress because her mother had made the fabric, and you did not leave behind what your mother had made, even when you had no plan for it, especially then. Silas was at the front of the church. He'd gotten a haircut, which she'd noticed the day before without saying anything, and he was wearing the dark coat she'd seen hanging in his bedroom doorway for months without ever seeing him put it on. He turned when she came down the aisle and looked at her in the way he looked at things when they surprised him, with a stillness that meant he was absorbing something he hadn't prepared for. She walked toward him and thought about all the walking she had done. 4 miles across a Kansas prairie with a worn-out trunk. 40 minutes in 15 below cold to a family whose stove had cracked. Back and forth across a yard, from barn to cellar to kitchen to garden, season after season, the kind of walking that added up into something that had no single name, but that she understood now as the shape of her life, the particular geography of who she'd become. She reached him. He took her hand. His was rough and warm, which she'd known it would be. You look, he started. Don't, she said, not unkindly. He almost smiled. I wasn't going to say anything foolish. I know, she said. Do it anyway. After. His almost smile completed itself, just slightly. Pastor Ames said the words. Martha and Silas said the words back. Thomas, beside Silas, stood with his hands folded and his good shirt buttoned to the collar, and his eyes moving between them with that particular quality of attention he gave to things he was storing carefully, things he wanted to keep. When it was done, Sarah Fenwick cried quietly into a handkerchief and then pretended she hadn't. Tom Halbert shook Silas's hand for a long time without saying much. Ruth Wickham hugged Martha with a firmness that communicated a number of things that didn't need to be put into words. Dell said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer," with an awkwardness that was so genuine it came back around to being touching, and Martha thanked him and watched his neck go red and felt a considerable affection for him that she was careful not to express in any way that would make it worse. They had the cake before the meal, because Thomas had negotiated for it, and a negotiated agreement was binding. It was the German cake, the same one she'd made for Thomas's birthday in February, the one from her mother's recipe. She'd made it the day before, and it was not as light as her mother's had always been, because her mother had a particular technique with the eggs that Martha had been trying to replicate her entire adult life and had never quite gotten right. She'd gotten closer this time. Thomas ate 2 pieces and did not comment on the technical quality of the crumb, which Martha considered an endorsement. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the 3 of them on the wagon bench in the now familiar arrangement, except that today it was different in a way that was not dramatic and not loud, but was entirely real. Something had been named, something that had been quietly accumulating since August had been given its proper word, and the word changed the shape of everything without changing the substance of any of it. The ranch looked the same from the gate. It always looked the same from the gate. The main house solid, the bluff behind it reddish in the late sun, the yard with its various ongoing states of repair. But Martha had stopped seeing it the way she'd first seen it, the sagging fence, the disorganized cellar, the unminded kitchen garden. She saw it now the way you saw a place you belonged to, not as a collection of problems, but as a place with a history and a future, and her name in both of them. Thomas jumped down from the wagon before it stopped, because he never waited for it to stop, which was something Martha had been managing her anxiety about since October. "Thomas," she said. "I'm fine," he said, already on the ground and entirely fine, running toward the barn to check on something only he considered urgent. Silas looked after him. "I've been telling him not to do that since he was 5, he said. "I know," Martha said. "He'll stop when he hurts himself." "That's what Anna said," Silas said. He said it quietly, the way he always said her name, but without the quality of pain it had carried even in April. More like settling, like a thing that had found its right place on the shelf, where it was going to stay. Martha climbed down from the wagon. Silas put August in the barn, and Martha went to the kitchen and started on supper, because the world did not pause for weddings any more than it paused for storms or cold snaps or any of the other things it offered without asking your preference first. The stove needed wood. The bread she'd made that morning was wrapped on the counter. She had a pot of beans that had been slow cooking all day on the back of the stove because she'd started them before they left, and the smell of them when she came in the door was the smell of a house that was being lived in with intention. She stood in the kitchen and breathed it in. Then she got out the bowls. 3 weeks after the wedding, Gerald Ellsworth arrived. She hadn't known he was coming. There was no telegram, no letter, no warning of any kind. One morning in the first week of June, she looked out the kitchen window while she was making breakfast, and there was a man at the gate she didn't recognize from the distance. And then she did recognize him, and she went very still for a moment at the counter. Silas was already in the Northfield with Dell. Thomas was at the kitchen table doing his morning lessons, bent over his arithmetic with that focused tongue at the corner concentration. Martha dried her hands. "I'll be right back," she said to Thomas, and she said it in the tone that meant, "Continue what you're doing," not the tone that invited questions. And Thomas, who had become a good reader of her tones over 9 months, looked up briefly and then looked back down at his arithmetic. She went out to the gate. Gerald Ellsworth was heavier than she remembered, which surprised her, because she had filed him in memory as a physically imposing man, and found now that what she'd remembered as imposing was mostly the particular quality of authority he'd always carried, the way he occupied space, the set of his shoulders, the voice that expected to be the loudest one. He was actually not much taller than she was, and the weight had settled around him in the way of men who had been substantial and were now merely large. He looked at her across the gate, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Martha," he said. "Uncle Gerald," she said. She said it evenly, without warmth but without hostility either, the way you said the name of a fact. "I heard you were here," he said. "I heard you'd married." "That's right," she said. He looked at the ranch behind her, the house, the yard, the bluff. She watched him looking at it and understood what he was doing. The same inventory she'd run on everything she'd ever encountered, assessing, estimating, categorizing. "You're doing well," he said. It came out slightly wrong, like he'd meant to say something else, and this was what had arrived instead. "Yes," she said. A pause. A horse somewhere in the yard behind her made a comment about something. The June morning was warm and clear and busy with birdsong in a way that made the silence between them feel slightly absurd. "I came to—" Gerald stopped. He looked at his hat, which was in his hands, not on his head. She had never seen Gerald Ellsworth hold his hat in his hands before. He had always been a hat-on kind of man. "I came because I wanted to—" He stopped again. Martha waited. She was good at waiting. "Your father's house sold," he said. "In the spring. I got a fair price." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "Your share," he said. "A third." That's what he'd have wanted. Martha looked at the envelope. She looked at Gerald. She thought about that Saturday morning in the kitchen, the coffee he'd poured from her father's pot, the papers he'd gone through while she went to her room and sat on the bed and decided something she still couldn't name precisely. "He left no will," she said. "You said so yourself." "I know what I said," Gerald said. "This is what I'm saying now." She took the envelope. She didn't open it. She held it for a moment and looked at her uncle, this man who had done a practical thing in a practical way and had not been wrong about the law, but had been wrong about other things. The way people were often right about facts and wrong about what the facts meant. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. Not fully. She was still working on that part, and she wasn't sure it would ever be fully, and she'd made a kind of peace with that. But enough. Gerald nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at the ranch one more time. "He'd have been pleased," he said. "Your father. Seeing you. Like this." He made a gesture that took in the yard, the house, the gate, all of it. "He always said you'd land somewhere that needed you." Martha looked at him. The morning light was coming over the bluff, and the yard was doing what the yard did in June, filling up with everything that was happening in the best season. The animals out, the kitchen garden full and serious, the sound of Thomas's voice starting up from inside the house, apparently engaged in a debate with his arithmetic. "He was right," she said. Gerald touched the brim of his hat and drove away, and Martha stood at the gate and watched him go, the dust from the wagon rising and thinning and disappearing, and she held the envelope and thought about her father in the particular way she let herself think about him now, not with the raw, winded quality of new grief, but with the steady, permanent ache of someone you were done losing and would always miss. She went back inside. Thomas looked up from his arithmetic. He looked at her face, then at the envelope, then at her face again. "Who was that?" he said. "My uncle," she said. Thomas looked at the door, then back at her. "Is he a bad person?" he asked. He asked it with the directness of someone who had decided this was relevant information and wanted it. Martha sat back down at the table. She put the envelope beside her. She thought about how to answer honestly. "He's a person who made a practical decision when a practical decision was easier than a kind one," she said. "People do that. It doesn't make them entirely bad. It makes them limited." Thomas thought about this. "Do you forgive him?" he said. "I'm working on it," Martha said. Thomas nodded slowly, accepting this as a complete answer, which it was. He went back to his arithmetic. Martha opened the envelope. The amount inside made her breathe out slowly, not with relief exactly, but with a shift in weight, the particular lightness of a thing that had been held in tension releasing. It was enough. It was more than enough for what she had in mind. She set it aside and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table while Thomas worked his numbers, and she looked out the kitchen window at the June yard, and she thought about what enough could do. She told Silas about the money that evening, after Thomas was in bed. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to value most about him. He didn't perform listening the way some people did. He just actually did it, tracking what she said, storing it, not preparing his response while she was still talking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's your money," he said, "from your father's house. It's yours." "I know it's mine," she said. "I'm telling you what I want to do with it." He looked at her. "The Calder property," she said. "It's been sitting empty since fall. Cole Fenwick told me last week that the Calder family sold the deed to a land agent in Hutchinson, and the agent's been trying to unload it since March without success because it needs too much work and nobody local has the cash." Silas was very still. "Martha, it's 240 acres," she said. "It's got a creek on the north end, and the soil is better than this parcel on the east side. It needs a new roof on the barn, and the house needs work, but the foundation is sound. I went and looked at it last month." "You went and looked at it," he said. "With Sarah," she said. "We took the wagon on a Tuesday." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, the one that was working to keep up with her, the one that appeared when she'd been thinking about something for longer than he'd known she was thinking about it. "It's going to be cheap," she said, "because nobody can afford it, and the agent wants to move it. With the money from my father's house and what you've been saving since fall." She stopped. "We'd own enough land to weather the next bad year, and the year after that. We'd have the creek rights, which would change your summer irrigation problem entirely. And—" She stopped again. "And?" Silas said. "Henry Marsh," she said, "the young man who came in February with the list. He's been working with Tom Halbert since March, but Halbert's not going to be able to keep that operation going past next year. He's 72, and he knows it. Henry needs land, and he knows how to work, but he doesn't have capital." She kept Silas's eyes. "If we buy the Calder property and offer Henry a share farming arrangement on the east parcel, fair terms, real terms, we'd be working more land than we can manage alone. He'd be building towards something real, and the valley has one more stable operation instead of another abandoned homestead." The kitchen was quiet. Silas put his coffee down very deliberately on the table. "You've been planning this since February," he said. "Since January," she said. "February is when I started the numbers." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window, where the June evening was going soft and golden in that way that made the Kansas landscape look like it was trying to apologize for everything it put people through. "That's a big risk," he said. "Yes," Martha said. "It's also a good idea. Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No," she said. "They're not." He was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet because she knew by now what his quiet meant. It meant he was running numbers and running contingencies and checking the thing against what he knew about the land and the weather and the people involved. She'd seen him do it all winter, and she trusted the process, even when it was slow. "Henry Marsh," he said finally, "you think he's steady?" "I think he's green and he's honest and he works hard and he learns fast," Martha said. "Same description someone could have given me 10 months ago." Silas looked at her. "Is that a fair point?" she asked. "That's a very fair point," he said. He picked up his coffee again. "I'd want to talk to him before anything." "I'd expect you to," Martha said, "and I'd want Cole Fenwick's read on him." "Cole's already told me he thinks Henry's the best young farmer in the valley," Martha said. "I asked him in April." Silas sat back in his chair. He had the expression of a man who has realized he's arrived slightly late to a conversation that started without him and is deciding whether to be unsettled by this or simply to catch up. He caught up. "Show me the numbers," he said. She pulled her notebook out from where it had been sitting on the counter, already open to the right page. They bought the Calder property in July, after 3 weeks of negotiation with the land agent in Hutchinson, which Martha handled primarily by mail, with a directness that appeared to unsettle the agent somewhat. And one afternoon of driving the parcel with Silas and Henry Marsh together, walking the creek line, checking the soil, assessing the barn. Henry Marsh on the Calder property was different from Henry Marsh in a kitchen with a list of problems. On the land, he was quiet and observant in a way that reminded Martha of something she recognized, and it took her most of the afternoon to place it. He looked at the land the way she looked at a room she was going to fix, taking inventory, locating the problems and the possibilities simultaneously, not as separate categories, but as the same thing. Silas watched this too. On the drive back, he said nothing about it, and Martha said nothing about it, and the silence between them on the wagon bench was the compact, communicating kind that meant they had arrived at the same conclusion and didn't need to announce it. Henry Marsh signed the share farming agreement on a Thursday morning at the Iron Bluff kitchen table with Silas across from him and Martha at the counter, and Thomas doing his lessons at the end of the table with the elaborate pretense of not listening, that fooled absolutely no one. When the agreement was signed, Henry looked at it for a moment and then at Martha. "You drew this up?" he said. "I wrote the terms," Martha said. Silas reviewed them. "They're fair," Henry said. "More than fair." "Fair is what they're supposed to be," Martha said. "That's why we said fair." Henry almost smiled. He was learning, Martha had noticed, to almost smile in the vicinity of her, which she attributed to the fact that she was mostly serious in a way that occasionally landed as dry and serious. But occasionally dry was a register Henry Marsh understood. He shook Silas's hand. He shook Martha's hand. He started for the door. "Henry," Thomas said from the end of the table, without looking up from his lessons. Henry turned. "Yeah?" "The south field on the Calder parcel," Thomas said. "The drainage on the east end is wrong. You'll want to regrade it before you plant." Henry looked at him. Thomas had gone back to his arithmetic, pencil moving. Henry looked at Martha. Martha looked at her coffee. "How does he know that?" Henry said. "He came with me when I walked the property in March," Martha said. "He pays attention." Henry put his hat on. "Good to know," he said, and went. The summer that followed was the hardest work Martha had done since arriving at Iron Bluff, and Iron Bluff had never been easy. 2 properties running simultaneously, the complexity of the share farming arrangement in its early stages, the learning curve of Henry understanding Silas's methods, and Silas understanding Henry's, and all of it under a July sun that had apparently decided to make up for January's cold with compound interest. Martha kept her notebook. She kept her lists. She fixed the things that needed fixing on both properties, because she'd begun doing that, driving over to the Calder place on Tuesday afternoons to check on the barn roof repair progress and the foundation work on the house, bringing Thomas along because he had developed a detailed ongoing interest in the structural integrity of the house's north wall and had opinions about it that were, mostly, correct. She was there one Tuesday in August. It was late August, almost exactly a year since she'd come through the Iron Bluff gate with her trunk on a cart, when Thomas sat down on the grass beside the Calder house and looked up at the sky. "Same sky as last year," he said. Martha stood beside him and looked up. He was right. The same late August blue, the same particular quality of heat that had weight to it, the same northwest horizon that was worth watching. "It is," she said. "You fixed the cellar latch," Thomas said, "that morning." She looked at him. He was looking at the sky. He'd grown 2 inches since September. She'd noted it in the same way she noted everything, quietly, with the specific satisfaction of watching something develop. "I did," she said. "Before anyone asked you to," he said. "Before you had any reason to." "The latch needed fixing," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "I asked Papa once why he hired you." Martha sat down in the grass beside him. "What did he say?" "He said he didn't have a better option," Thomas said. "And then he said—" Thomas stopped, turned a piece of grass in his fingers the way he did when he was thinking. "He said that was the wrong answer. He said the right answer was that he was lucky, and he didn't know it yet." Martha looked at the sky. "He's not wrong," she said. "About which part?" Thomas said. "Either," she said. Thomas lay back in his grass with his hands behind his head and looked at the sky with the absolute ease of a child who knew where he was and knew it was safe. Martha sat beside him in the August heat and looked at the northwest horizon and thought about all the things she had known before other people knew them. The storm, the cold, the hunger coming down the valley, the slow accumulation of hard winters that could either break a place or build one, depending on the choices made by the people inside it. She had made choices. She was still making them. She thought about what she would write to her sister. Her sister had come to visit in June, had made the journey from Pennsylvania with her husband, and had stood in the Iron Bluff kitchen and looked at everything with the particular attention of someone who loves you and has been worrying about you and is now trying to evaluate whether the worry was warranted. Her sister had pulled her aside on the second evening and said quietly, "You look different." "I've been working outdoors for a year," Martha said. "Not that kind of different," her sister said. She'd looked at Martha for a long moment with that frank, direct look that sisters allowed themselves. "You look like you know where you are." Martha had thought about that for a long time afterward. "You look like you know where you are." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet she understood exactly what her sister meant, because she remembered what it felt like before. The years of being in places that were adequate, places she managed in, places where she was competent and reliable, and fundamentally unnecessary in a way that she'd learned not to examine too closely. She'd been everywhere and somewhere and nowhere all at once, and it had looked like competence from the outside and felt like drift from the inside. And then a gate had opened on the Kansas plain, and she had walked through it, and the drift had stopped, and she had been here. Specifically here, where everything she was had been needed in exactly the measure that she had it. That was the thing that was hard to explain to people who hadn't felt it. The world was full of people who were capable and competent, and who spent their whole lives in places that used only a portion of them, that needed the professional and not the person, the function and not the whole. And then sometimes, not often, not guaranteed, not something you could engineer, sometimes you found the thing that fit the whole of you, that needed the parts of you that other places had called inconvenient or excessive or simply didn't see. Martha had found it by accident because she'd had $17 and no other options. She did not think the accident was what mattered. What mattered was that when she stood at the gate, she had walked through it. What mattered was the first morning, the cellar latch, before sunrise, before anyone asked. What mattered was that she had not waited to be needed. She had simply been what she was, fully and without apology, and the place had needed that. Thomas sat up beside her. "The Northwest is doing something," he said. Martha looked. The horizon had changed in the last 10 minutes. Not dramatically, not yet, but she knew what she was seeing. "Yes," she said, "but not today. Maybe tomorrow evening." Thomas looked at it for a moment, assessing, cross-referencing against what he'd learned over the last year. The accumulation of mornings watching with her, evenings at the kitchen table with the notebook, Tuesdays in the yard reading the particular language of the Kansas sky. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said, "not evening." Martha looked at the horizon again. "Maybe," she said. Thomas looked at her sideways. "Are you agreeing with me, or are you being diplomatic?" "I'm being precise," she said. "Maybe tomorrow afternoon, possibly evening. We'll watch it." He nodded, satisfied. He had learned that "we'll watch it" was not a dismissal, but an invitation, and that watching was its own kind of answer. They drove back to Iron Bluff in the late afternoon, the horse moving steadily through the August heat. Thomas drove, which he'd been doing for 6 months on the slower stretches of familiar road, his hands on the reins with the careful seriousness of someone doing something real and knowing it. Silas was in the yard when they came through the gate. He'd been mending something on the barn door. There was always something to mend, and he straightened and looked at them over the yard in that way of his. The slight stillness that meant he was checking that everyone had come back. "How's the north wall?" he called. "Better," Thomas called back. "Henry's putting the new boards on tomorrow." Silas looked at Martha. She nodded. He turned back to the barn door. They had been having conversations like this for a year now. The three-way exchange, quick and practical, and assuming shared context, the vocabulary of a family that had developed its own shorthand. Martha had noticed it happening and had not noted it in the notebook, because some things you kept differently from a list. Thomas jumped down from the wagon and went to help Silas with the barn door, inserting himself into the task with the confidence of someone who knew he'd be let in. Martha watched them for a moment, the man and the boy, the patched barn door, the late August light coming golden over the bluff, and felt that particular fullness that was not happiness exactly, but contained it, the way a good cellar contained things you'd put up carefully against the coming winter, the way a solid house contained everything that happened inside it. She took the horse to the barn. She did it herself, because August was her horse as much as Silas's now, in the way that things on the ranch had gradually redistributed themselves into a different kind of ownership, not by negotiation, but by use and care and habit, the truest way anything ever became yours. She unhitched him, led him to his stall, checked his water, gave him his feed. He turned to look at her over the stall door with the expression horses had when they were comfortable, half attention, half content vacancy. And she put her hand on his nose for a moment. "Good boy," she said. She meant it more broadly than that. She came out of the barn into the August evening, and Silas and Thomas had finished with the door, and Thomas was telling Silas something about the Calder property's north wall, with the focused energy he brought to things he'd been thinking about all day, and was finally able to report, and Silas was listening with that real listening of his, and the kitchen window behind the house was warm with the light that meant the stove was already warming for supper. Martha stood in the yard and looked at it all. The fixed fence, the solid cellar door, the kitchen garden that Thomas had largely planted himself this year, and that was producing better than the year before and would produce better still next year as the soil got worked properly. The bluff, reddish and low and permanent. The sky to the northwest, which she was still watching, which would tell her what it was going to do in its own time. She was 30 years old. She had been on this ranch for a year. She had a husband who listened, and a son who drove the wagon on the familiar stretches, and a property that was growing, and a valley that had come through a hard winter better than it would have without her. And she knew this not with pride exactly, but with the plain, solid knowledge of someone who had done the work and seen the results. Her mother at 12, alone on a ship with dead parents and a cousin's address. Her mother at 50, at the kitchen table, hands that had never stopped working. You come from people who did not quit. Martha Ellsworth Mercer stood in the yard of Iron Bluff Ranch in the last light of an August evening and felt the truth of that in her bones, in her chapped hands, in the specific weight of a body that had carried her 4 miles with a trunk and through a storm and across a winter and into a life that was, improbably and exactly, her own. The Northwest was watching. She was watching back. Thomas called from the porch. "Are we eating?" "In 20 minutes," she said. "The cake is still from this morning," he said, with the optimism of a child checking a known variable. "The cake is still from this morning," she confirmed. Silas looked at her across the yard. Just a look. The kind they'd developed that didn't need much attached to it because it had accumulated enough over the year to carry its own weight. She looked back. 20 minutes, she said. She went inside to start supper, and the screen door swung shut behind her, and the kitchen was warm, and the stove was going, and the August evening settled over Iron Bluff Ranch, the way evenings settled everywhere, without ceremony, without announcement, ordinary and unrepeatable. The kind of thing that only looked like nothing until it was over and you understood what it had been. It had been everything. It had been, all along, everything.